On January 1st, 1863, in Medford, Massachusetts, businessman George L. Stearns held what he called the John Brown Party, where a marble bust of John Brown was unveiled, who had been hung just 3 years prior. The day was a special occasion. United States President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. At Harper's Ferry, where John Brown had launched a raid to start a slave rebellion, Union General Robert H. Milroy read the proclamation to his soldiers stationed there, and when finished, the crowd erupted into the song John Brown's Body. Milroy stated, "That handbill order gave freedom to the slaves through and around the region where old John Brown was hung. I felt then that I was on duty in the most righteous cause that man ever drew sword in." Back in Medford, the party included some of the country's most ardent abolitionists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Wendell Phillips, and William Lloyd Garrison. Others included Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic to the tune of John Brown's Body, and Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. Stearns himself had been a backer of John Brown and said, "I consider it the proudest act of my life that I gave good old John Brown every pike and rifle he carried to Harper's Ferry." Those gathered at that party believed that without John Brown, Emancipation Day, as it would be called, would never have come. They had been and continued to be skeptical of Abraham Lincoln, who took a more moderate stance toward slavery than they who attended the party. Lincoln had advocated for the relocation of African Americans, believing neither race could coexist on equal terms together. William Lloyd Garrison wrote of Lincoln, "He has evidently not a drop of anti-slavery blood in his veins, and he seems incapable of uttering a humane or generous sentiment respecting the enslaved millions in our land." One of Brown's biographers explained, "Perhaps the most significant meaning of the John Brown Party was that everyone present was joined by an idealistic vision of a man who, in other circles, was branded a murderer, a thief, and an insane fanatic. The pristine purity of the bust was as distant from John Brown's real looks as the starry-eyed hero worship of Stearns's guest was from a true appraisal of his achievements. The reality is somewhere in the middle. John Brown was and is a complicated figure. Some see him as incredibly progressive, which he was, and some see him as violent to excess, which he was in many instances. But that should make us want to explore the man even more. Civil War historians have battled over when did the Civil War begin. None argue against the firing on Fort Sumter as the signal for the beginning of the war itself, but did the Civil War represent something more than simply military engagements? Many say yes, and of those, some point to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry as the beginning of the Civil War, the beginning of that divide that could not be patched together by compromising politicians. Southern Democrats pointed to Brown's actions and argued that Northern Republicans had supported the raid and would use more violent tactics like that to instigate slave rebellion throughout the slaveholding states, when that was not true. Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, reacted in horror at the violent tactics used by Brown during the raid. Militant abolitionists were in the far minority of Northerners. The deepening of the chasm between the North and the South was aided by the actions of John Brown. Brown's family most likely came to Plymouth on the Mayflower. The Puritan beliefs of his family would greatly impact his future. The family tree was filled with ministers, and his grandfather, on his mother's side, Gideon Mills, fought in the American Revolution as a lieutenant. John Brown's father was named Owen, and he was born in West Simsbury, Connecticut. When Owen was 5, his father, who had joined Connecticut's 18th Regiment as a captain, died of dysentery in a Continental Army camp north of New York City. This left Owen and his 10 siblings under the sole parentage of his mother, who tried to keep the family fed. Owen would be sent to live with relatives over the coming years and then make his way back home. In 1782, a religious revival swept the area, converting his mother, his older sisters, and a brother, as well as himself. He would devote the rest of his life to a search for signs of salvation in himself and his loved ones. He adopted the Calvinistic ideas that a sovereign God freely gave grace to totally depraved humans. He believed in predestination and that humans received conversion not as a reward for good works, but as a gift arbitrarily bestowed by the divine judge. Owen was a traveling cobbler throughout his area of New England. Owen would meet Ruth Mills, a similarly devout Calvinist, and they would marry on February 13, 1793, in West Simsbury. The couple would move to Norfolk, Connecticut, and settle down into a modest life. Tragedy struck the couple when their first child died at 2 years old and another shortly after birth. Their daughter Anne would be born in July of 1798. 2 years later, on May 9th, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut, John Brown was born. The family within which he was born passed their abolitionist and Calvinist views on to their son. His father had seen slavery firsthand in his youth in Connecticut when slavery was not yet divided between North and South. His mother, to make ends meet, borrowed a neighbor's slave to plant crops or bring in a harvest. Owen remembered playing with the slave whose name was Sam. The Puritan religious fervor that denounced slavery played an important role in Owen's life and in John's life. Owen passed on the belief that slavery violated the Golden Rule and thus should be abolished. He read and heard the sermons of George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and Jonathan Edwards Jr., passing this piety and hostility towards slavery to his son. Owen remembered that one incident involving slavery that solidly made him an abolitionist was when a Southern clergyman came north during the Revolution and brought his slaves with him. He kept them in Norfolk, Connecticut for safety reasons as he traveled, and when he returned, the enslaved men and women declared themselves Northerners and refused to go back south with him. He had a hearing but was chastised by the local community and left without his slaves. Owen said, "Ever since I have been an abolitionist. I am so near the end of my life I think I shall die an abolitionist." In June 1805, Owen, his wife Ruth, and 4 children, including John and an adopted son, traveled in an ox-pulled wagon to Hudson, Ohio. The family moved into a one-room log house with a loft for a larger sleeping arrangement. The first spring in Ohio, the family's crops were decimated by birds and squirrels, as well as an unexpected summertime frost. Despite the difficulties, John's father persevered and earned enough money as a land surveyor to buy a new home and establish a tannery. His tanning business had not done well in New England and was one of the reasons the family moved. John's family traded meal and bread with Native Americans for turkey and venison and lived in harmony with the various tribes in that region. John's father reinforced the belief to his children that they should treat everyone the same, no matter their skin color. John spent time with the Native Americans, learned a little of their language, learned to skin deer, and was wearing buckskin just like his Native American friends. After the War of 1812, most of the Native Americans in that area left Ohio. John at first resisted his parents' religiosity. They worried about his piety and were quick to use the rod to reprimand him. When John stole 3 brass pins from a girl who lived with them, his mother let him brood over the sin for a day, then gave him a thorough whipping the next. His school was intermittent. His father needed help at the tannery, so John did not attend school often. He did attend long enough to realize he didn't like math. When one of his friends introduced him to a couple of volumes of history, John found that he liked to read. His grammar was horrible, something he never really sought to improve. Still, he developed a sinewy writing style forceful enough to elicit high praise from Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who said that Brown's prose, with all of its technical errors, defined standard English. Although not one to start fights, he loved to roughhouse. The boys around Hudson formed little gangs called Federalists and Republicans, mimicking their parents' political affiliations. John's father was a Federalist. He opposed Jefferson and Madison, the Democratic Republicans, because of their slaveholding. During a harsh snowball fight between the two gangs of boys, the Republicans were gaining the advantage and hurting many of the Federalists. John, seizing the initiative, ran headlong into the Republicans and dispersed them single-handedly. In 1808, his mother passed away in childbirth, leaving Owen with 6 children to care for. Owen quickly sought out another wife and found 20-year-old Sally Root. John admitted that she was a nice, intelligent woman, but he never developed any feelings for her. During the War of 1812, John accompanied his father on the nearly 200-mile cattle drives to sell the cattle to General William Hull's army in Michigan. At least once, Owen sent John on his own to drive cattle to the American army. It was on these long journeys that John Brown had 2 revelations. The first one was that he never wanted to serve in the military. The profanity, disobedience, and mutinous talk of the soldiers appalled him, and he vowed to never serve. Men were obligated to serve in the militia, especially on the frontier, like John's family in Ohio, or be subject to a fine. John would always pay the fine. The second revelation relates to slavery. At one point, he stayed with a family on the journey. They had a slave boy the same age as John. John saw how horribly the slave boy was treated as compared to himself based solely on their skin color. The slave owner praised John for his ability to tackle a journey like that on his own, away from his family. John got to know the slave boy, the little time he spent with him, and learned he was perceptive and intelligent. Yet the slave owner beat him with household tools and in general maltreated the poor boy. He would call this incident a main factor in the process that, in the end, made him a most determined abolitionist, leading him to declare or swear eternal war with slavery. After wrestling with a skepticism of religion and feeling guilt for his sinful nature at the age of 16, he announced his repentance and his acceptance of Christ in the small schoolhouse that served as the Hudson Congregational Church. He turned to religious studies. He avidly read the Bible, accepting its divine authenticity and aiming to commit its entire contents to memory. Soon after his conversion, he and his brother Salmon would travel east to further their religious studies, first at Plainfield, Massachusetts, but after a few months, John would go to Morris Academy in Litchfield, Connecticut. One time at the academy, Salmon committed an infraction. John asked the instructor if he planned on punishing Salmon because John's father would punish Salmon for that infraction at home. The instructor thought better than punish the young man, but John, acting in a fatherly role, flogged his brother for the infraction. John wanted to advance his studies and become a minister by going to Amherst College, but funds were running low and he had to return to Ohio in 1817. Before long, he started his own tannery business about a mile north of the town of Hudson with his adopted brother Levi Blakesley. John Brown at 18 was a lean man of 5 feet 10 inches, with dark hair brushed straight back and a chiseled face whose determined look was accented by hollow cheeks, a sharp jaw, and glittering gray-blue eyes. Plain in dress, he was fastidiously neat. Purposeful and tenacious, he liked establishing plans and sticking to them, confident of success. Soon after establishing his tanning business, John fought against the institution of slavery for the first time. A runaway slave approached John and Levi, asking to be protected from his white pursuers. John brought the man into his cabin, and when horse hooves were heard beating the ground, John instructed the man to escape through the window and hide in the brush. When it was discovered that the sound was just his neighbors riding back from town, John went to fetch the runaway, only to find him cowering behind a log. The prone and paranoid state that slavery put the runaway in was enough to convince John to vow eternal enmity to slavery. By early 1820, the size and responsibility of his tannery forced John to hire a housekeeper to do the chores around the cabin. He hired a widow named Miss Amos Lusk. Her 19-year-old daughter, Diantha, would help her in these duties. Diantha was a plain woman, but very pious, which matched perfectly with John. After a few-month courtship, John and Diantha would marry on June 21st, 1820. Diantha and her family had a history of mental illness, which made the marriage sometimes difficult, although it is not in this early stage when she showed signs of it. Doctors of the time period would label her mental illness as bouts of insanity, and some of John and Diantha's children would exhibit some similar problems. John would run into trouble with his brother-in-law, who wanted to see his sister on his only days off, Sunday, but John would not allow visits on Sunday because that would be breaking the commandment to honor the Sabbath. Although not endearing to his wife's family, he wanted to start his own and have many children. He would raise these children in the fashion similar to how he was raised, with strict religiousness. Brown's interpretation of Calvinism drew equally from the Old and the New Testaments, both of which he knew as well as any preacher. From the Old, he derived a belief in a stern, judgmental God who commanded humans to fight for justice and to increase and multiply. From the New, he absorbed the idea of a loving, self-sacrificing Christ and a sympathy for those in bonds, joined with an absolute belief in predestination, which was inherited from Jonathan Edwards. This religious outlook made Brown and his children come to believe that they were chosen by God to free millions of enslaved blacks. When John talked about family, he did not only mean his wife and children, he meant all those around him and those that took part in his religion. He ruled that all of the workers at his tannery must attend church every Sabbath and family worship every morning. At one point, a worker in the tannery stole a piece of fine calf skin. Brown found out about this thievery and gave the man a tongue lashing. The man began to break down and cry and said he would leave and never return. John declined that offer and said if the man left, then he would prosecute him, that he should stay, but his punishment was that no other worker could talk to him for 2 months. According to the other employees, The punishment transformed the young man, and he became a useful worker afterward. When riding by an apple orchard, he spied two men filling large bags with apples that were not theirs. So he told them he would not report the crime if they owned up to their act. They did, and he commenced lecturing them on the wickedness of stealing. In his mind, God was the only true judge, and he, God's servant, was the enforcer of divine law. Although not the best businessman, he did well for himself. He was incredibly honest. For instance, if any moisture remained in the tanned hide after the tanning process, he would not sell it because he had not lived up to his side of the deal. A family in the Hudson neighborhood became destitute, and John gave the father a position at the tannery despite not having any openings, and gave him food and clothing as an advance payment. While in Hudson, he taught Sunday school at the local Congregational church. He even joined the local Masonic lodge, but quit when the Masons became embroiled in a scandal surrounding the disappearance of William Morgan, who was allegedly murdered by members of the group. Despite his sometimes questionable business practices, he did earn enough to afford multiple parcels of land and build a white frame house. On July 25, 1821, they had their first child, a boy they named after his father. Then, 19 months later, Jason was born, followed by Owen in November 1824. These three children took the brunt of Brown's Old Testament-style discipline. They were not allowed to play or have visitors on Sunday. One of his sons explained that their father did not threaten his children. He commanded them, and they obeyed. If they did not obey, the rod or the switch was always ready. John believed his own sinful nature was the reason for his children's disobedience. This explains the masochistic extremes to which he could take his punishment toward them. He paid particular attention to his oldest son, John Jr., who was put to work in the tannery at an early age, driving a blind horse in a circle to grind bark. For the infraction of daydreaming, he would be punished. Brown kept a ledger accounting the children's punishments. For example, John Jr.'s record reads, "For disobeying mother, 8 lashes. For unfaithfulness at work, 3 lashes. For telling a lie, 8 lashes. He would show the record book to his children, and at one point decided that the boy's debits outnumbered his credits and took him to the barn for accounting. Brown cut a switch from a beech tree and gave him a third of the lashings the boy had earned. Then he took off his shirt and told his son to whip him. At first, John Jr. laid the lashes in lightly, but when his father told him to beat him harder, the son complied. Brown wanted his son to understand that when he disobeyed his father, that hurt him too. Brown also felt that his son's disobedience was his own fault and needed to account for his own sins. John Brown loved rural life and living off the land. He molded his life after the biblical patriarchs who were farmers and shepherds. That is why in May 1826, Brown moved his wife and 3 children to western Pennsylvania, where a large section of land came available, and he acquired a 200-acre parcel of that land. The community was named Randolph, soon to be New Richmond, and Brown would enjoy its open spaces and wilderness. Brown cleared 25 acres of timberland and built a cabin, a barn, and a tannery. The house was divided into 2 large rooms, but the tannery was the more impressive structure. It was 26 feet by 50 feet and held 18 vats. Within a year, Brown had hired 10 to 15 workers for the tannery. However, the sparse population led to fewer business than at Hudson, and a lack of cattle and sheep led to less easily accessible hides. So he struck a deal with his cousin who lived on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border and raised cattle. His cousin would send him cattle, and Brown would sell the beef to the locals for his cousin. Then Brown would send hides for his cousin to sell in the more populous area. It was mutually beneficial. The business prospered for a time, but it was difficult for Brown to get paid for the beef or hides, and he was forced to take out loans and buy things on credit. This would be a horrible problem for Brown in later years. One reason he enjoyed the tanning business was because he could be around animals, and it made him feel like a shepherd of the Old Testament. He also continued to shepherd his children toward a religious life. The family would also grow in number and have numerous problems. Owen suffered an obscure childhood injury that crippled his left arm for life. Diantha gave birth to Frederick, a sickly child that died at 4. Ruth was born on February 18, 1829, and the next year another Frederick was born, who was described as simple-minded and unstable. Losing a child in its early life, as well as getting older, changed John Brown's severity and punishments for the children. He became more loving in his older age, but still strict. Ruth remembered, "He sometimes seemed very stern and strict with me, yet his tenderness made me forget that he was stern." His wife's ailments that often left her incapacitated resulted in Brown having to attend to the children, especially if they were sick. He stayed up days on end doctoring his children back to health. One of the scariest times was when the household caught scarlet fever and he had to doctor multiple children at once. He likewise took special care of his animals, shepherding them as a good shepherd should. He revived many a nearly dead lamb by bringing it into the house, bathing it, and covering it in blankets and spoon-feeding it warm milk. He also shepherded the community that he had moved into. Since there was no schoolhouse or teacher, Brown welcomed the community children into his home to be taught by him, alongside his own children, until he could build a schoolhouse and hire a teacher. Another aspect he wanted to instill in his children was physical exercise. He never fully escaped his love of roughhousing of his youth, so one would often see him organizing wrestling matches in his house in which he would often participate. He was a pillar of the community and of great influence. When a man was jailed for stealing a cow, it was discovered that the man was incredibly poor and was released to take care of his family. Brown insisted that justice be served and had the man put back in jail to complete his sentence. While the man was in jail, Brown gave food and clothing to the family, while their father and husband was away. In another way that he was a pillar of the community, he created a public library ran out of his own house, full of famous books of the period to help everyone in the community improve their mind. He loved debates and would regularly schedule them with his family. However, there was one type of person he loved to debate: Methodist preachers. On one occasion, a Methodist preacher found his way into the community, as many did proselytizing to the people, and Brown basically insulted him and challenged him to a public debate. The preacher was not prepared to contend with a student of the works of Jonathan Edwards, and conceded defeat after a few questions about free will, human sinfulness, and Satan, all centered around predestination. One of the most popular reforms of the day was temperance, but Brown was conflicted. The Bible condoned drinking wine, but not to excess. In 1830, Brown would declare himself a teetotaler and never drink any alcohol again. He did not approve of hunting or fishing because he viewed it as a waste of time, although he did develop into a good marksman. On August 10, 1832, Brown lost his wife due to complications from childbirth, where the child died as well. He would write that, "We are again smarting under the rod of our Heavenly Father. Last night about 11 o'clock my affectionate, dutiful, and faithful Diantha, to use her own words, bade farewell to earth, and that I have been pretty much confined to my house for a number of weeks. I find I am getting more and more unfit for everything. I have been growing numb for a good while." The large family became too large for Brown himself to manage, and he hired a housekeeper. The housekeeper's 16-year-old daughter, Mary Day, would occasionally come with her mother and spin cloth. Brown took a liking to the young dark-haired woman, and soon after meeting her, too bashful to ask her to marry him in person, he wrote her a letter. Mary took the letter, didn't open it, put it under her pillow and slept on it for a night. The next morning she read it. During one of her jobs at the Brown house, which was fetching water from a nearby spring, Brown followed her, and by the time they came back to the house, she had agreed to marry him. They were wed on June 14, 1833. And in just 10 months, a baby girl was born, Sarah. As one of Brown's biographers put it, Mary would prove to be a rock of stability for John Brown. Staunch and stoical, she set a tone of quiet courage that would influence the whole family. At the time of her marriage, she was only half Brown's age, and 4 years older than his oldest son, but her stepchildren would always call her mother. It was also in the 1830s that Brown became disillusioned with American politics. In the 1820s, he supported John Quincy Adams, the abolitionist, and began to support the Whig Party. But when Henry Clay, the Kentucky slaveholder, who supported colonization, came to political prominence, he distanced himself from the Whigs. The party of Jackson, the Democrats, also did not appeal to him because of Jackson's slaveholding. So, after the 1830s, he began to distance himself from politics because he saw the politicians too entangled with the slave power of the South. In the 1830s, one of the most significant slave rebellions in American history took place, the Nat Turner Rebellion. When other abolitionists were abhorred by the violence used by Turner in the slave uprising, it was John who looked on Turner as a courageous man and saw violence as a key instrument to free the enslaved. Brown would have been fine with slavery ended peacefully, but he just did not see a situation where it could end in a peaceful manner. At this point, John was content, actively helping out the African American community in any way he could. He built a special room in his barn to conceal runaway slaves and helped as many as he could on their journey further north. Although his financial situation prevented him from pursuing his goal, he intended to build a school for African Americans because he believed the best way to freedom and equality was through education. At one point, he wanted to raise a black child as one of his own, and even contemplated purchasing one in order to free the child and raise it. His finances prevented him from pursuing that goal. On May 18, 1835, with the economy not supporting his tannery like he had hoped, John accepted an offer from a tanner at his old hometown of Hudson, Ohio, named Zenas Kent, to help run the tannery with him. On October 7th of that year, Mary gave birth to Brown's son, Watson. Shortly after moving to Hudson, his partnership with Kent fell through, and he took a job digging a canal in the area. The back-breaking labor got Brown to thinking about a way to make large amounts of money: land speculation. He knew the route of the canal and borrowed money to purchase 92.5 acres, and using his survey equipment, laid out a town with the canal planned to run through the center of the community. Unfortunately for Brown, work stopped on the canal as the builders contemplated rerouting it. Add on to this, John had purchased the land when the market was high, so he was not going to be able to recoup his investment. In the meantime, he started a tannery in Hudson, but his financial situation was deteriorating. At some points, he had to trade leather for food for his family, and that family was only growing larger. On October 2nd, 1836, Salmon was born, and on November 3rd, 1837, Charles was born. When a religious revival came through the area, the Brown family attended every meeting, but John recognized that the black attendees were relegated to the back of the church. The next meeting, Brown's family got up from their pews as John led the black attendees to sit in his family's seats closer to the front of the church. They continued to do this the entire time the revival was going on. When the deacons of the church attempted to address the situation with John, the ardent abolitionist and Puritan made them realize he would not budge on the subject of equal rights. When he found that he had been expelled from one of the churches for non-attendance, but he knew that the church and its members had expelled him and his family for the actions he had taken during the revival, he seldom ever darkened another church's door. Soon, a national event would fuel Brown's obsession with the destruction of slavery. The Nat Turner Rebellion sent shockwaves through the nation. Southern states began implementing stricter slave laws and black codes to hopefully prevent another such rebellion, but the North reacted as well. Pro-slavery mobs made up of Northerners and Southerners attacked abolitionists over the next couple of years. A pro-slavery mob grabbed William Lloyd Garrison on his way to deliver an anti-slavery speech in Boston, tied him and drug him through the city streets. Garrison did not believe in violence and asserted that violence was the tool of slavers that he would never use to combat them. However, the anti-abolitionist attacks hit a whole new level in 1837. Elijah Lovejoy fought against slavery by operating an anti-slavery newspaper. His print shop in St. Louis got destroyed by a pro-slavery mob. Then he moved his operation across the river to Illinois, where mobs destroyed his printing press on multiple occasions, including throwing it into the river. The town wanted to stop the printing of his newspaper, but he stood up for himself, arguing that he had a right to free speech and the freedom of the press. On November 7, 1837, a pro-slavery mob overpowered the 20 men sent to guard Lovejoy, and once in the building, they used a shotgun to kill Lovejoy. Anti-slavery politicians recoiled at such a horrible act perpetrated by pro-slavery citizens. At the second prayer meeting memorial held for Lovejoy in Hudson, led by a professor of theology from Western Reserve College, John Brown heard the professor talk about the horrible murder. The speech riled up Brown, and he stood up and declared, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." His father stood up beside him and stated, "When John the Baptist was beheaded, the disciples took up his body and laid it in a tomb and went and told Jesus. Let us now go to Jesus and tell him." Tears rolled down the old man's face as he led the group in prayer. This was a turning point for John Brown. So far, he acted in secret, helping individual slaves. From then on, he would challenge the institution directly. The Lovejoy episode turned other abolitionists away from violence. It sped Brown on a path toward it. After he declared publicly his mission to destroy slavery, he gathered his sons around him and asked them to pledge to him armed resistance to the institution of slavery. The boys agreed, and he led them in prayer. In the late 1830s, Brown got caught up in land speculation. He purchased a farm known as Westlands that had been deemed a perfect farm by him. He borrowed the funds for the purchase from the Western Reserve Bank and signed over his promissory note to 6 other people as a security. His haymaker land deal seemed more dismal when the canal planned for the area got rerouted, and it plummeted the value of his land. Worse yet, water was to be drained from the Cuyahoga River, reducing the water supply in Haymaker, making the land less valuable. Brown wasn't the only one suffering in the late 1830s. The Panic of 1837, brought on by Jackson's Bank War, hurt Americans financially. The Western Reserve Bank filed a lawsuit against Brown for lack of payment, and he referred them to those on the promissory note. This led him into even more battles with creditors and lawsuits filed against him. Needing money in a hurry to placate the Ohio banks filing lawsuits, he came up with a plan to herd cattle to Connecticut for sale, and while there, he would get a loan from a bank in New York or Boston to pay off his Ohio debts. In November 1838, Brown drove a herd of cattle to Connecticut and sold them to a firm called Wadsworth and Wells. Then he proceeded to Manhattan, where he failed to find a loan. Another possible spot to receive a loan was Boston. On his way there, he visited a grade school and lectured them on social justice and the evils of slavery. During the lecture, he asked who would use their time and effort to fight against the institution of slavery. Many hands went up. Then he made the question even more serious, asking who would dedicate their efforts to end slavery. 2 boys stood up. Brown put his hand on their heads and blessed the boys in the name of God, who is your Father and the Father of the African, the Son, who is your Savior and the Savior and Master of the African, and the Holy Spirit, which gives you strength and which gives strength and comfort to the African. He arrived in Boston the day after Christmas as a beggar, begging some friends of a friend for a loan. He was so confident that the loan would come through that on his way back to Ohio, he purchased a flock of Saxony sheep for $130. When he arrived in Ohio, no loan came, and he resolved to drive another herd east and go to Boston again, searching for a loan, this time for about $20,000. Brown returned to Connecticut with another herd of cattle, then went to Boston again, but the possibility of a loan became bleak. He wrote to Mary, "I am now somewhat in fear that I shall fail at getting the money I expected on the loan. Should that be the will of Providence, I know of no other way, but we must consider ourselves very poor, for our debts must be paid, if paid at a sacrifice. Should that happen, though it may not, I hope God, who is rich in mercy, will grant us grace to conform to our circumstances with cheerfulness and true resignation." His financial frustration drove him to do something that was at best unethical. He borrowed, to put it kindly, $5,500 from Wadsworth and Wells without telling them. It is unclear whether he simply held on to the proceeds of the cattle sale, which he should have given them their portion, or pilfered the money from the cash box in the West Hartford office. At any rate, he immediately sent the money back to Ohio to pay part of the loan on the Westlands farm. The firm threatened to have him arrested, but he held them at bay. He met George Kellogg during his stay in the East. George was an agent of the New England Wool Company of Rockville, Connecticut. Finding that Brown raised sheep and was somewhat of an expert in wool quality, Kellogg gave him an advance of $2,800 to send wool to the company once Brown returned to Ohio. Brown took Kellogg's money and gave it to Wadsworth and Wells. By June, Kellogg grew concerned that Brown did not live up to his end of the bargain. Brown still hoped that a loan would come from Boston and intended to pay Kellogg the money back when that loan came through. It seems as though Kellogg felt sympathy for Brown and thought his actions well-intentioned, not nefarious. Kellogg was right. In October 1842, Brown declared bankruptcy, but Brown would send Kellogg small amounts of money to repay the debt, even leaving $50 in his will to go toward Kellogg. However, he never came close to repaying the full amount. During all of this, Brown had 2 more children, Oliver in 1839 and Peter in 1840. In 1840, still attempting to rescue himself from crippling debt, he took part in another venture. His father was a trustee in the Oberlin Collegiate Institute. A wealthy philanthropist donated a large section of land to the institute in Western Virginia, now West Virginia. It needed to be surveyed because of conflicting land titles, and Owen secured his son the job of performing the survey in exchange for $1 a day plus expenses and the promise that he could purchase 1,000 acres cheaply from the institute from its holdings in Western Virginia. At the end of the survey, Oberlin offered him 1,000 acres of land, but at the time, Brown contemplated a partnership with a gentleman in Hudson and did not accept the offer. When he thought better of the partnership and said he would receive the offer, the Institute was in financial straits and they rescinded the offer. Brown haggled with them and ended up with a $29 settlement. Also in 1840, the bank sold his farm implements at Westlands to help pay off his debts, and in October, the land went up for sale. Brown now resided solely on his Hudson property. In an early display of his violent tendencies, he occupied the now sold land with his three oldest sons, armed with muskets. A sheriff arrested three of the Brown men, but released them quickly upon getting to the Akron jail. Because Brown signed a bond of conveyance to another gentleman and taken out liens against his property, the ownership of Westlands went to the Ohio Supreme Court, but Brown ultimately lost the property. When he declared bankruptcy in 1842, the court listed an inventory of Brown's possessions. The list reflects a very humble lifestyle. The inventory included 1 pot cracked, 50 cents, 4 wooden pails, old, $1.12 and a half, 6 bedsteads, old, $5.25, 3 bags, old, $1, 6 feather beds, old and poor, $6, 2 spinning wheels, $2, 4 milk pans, $1, 1 glass bottle, 10 cents, 1 tin canister, 9 cents, and 2 earthen pots broken of no value. The list suggests that the children, who now numbered 12, ranging from the 20-year-old John to an infant Austin born in September, were crammed into 5 beds. Brown did get to keep some of his animals and a small amount of farm tools, but these were paltry. 1843 was a hard year for the Brown family. They moved into a rentable cabin, and in September, the 6-year-old Charles came down with dysentery. Soon, 3 other children came down with the illness and died in rapid succession. Before the year came to a close, Brown buried 4 of his children, including an infant. In January 1844, Brown visited Akron, Ohio, and looked up Simon Perkins, the son of a War of 1812 general, who owned a substantial sheep herd and farm. Brown may not have been good with finances, but he knew 3 things very well: the Bible, leather, and wool. The latter impressed Perkins, who agreed to a partnership with Brown, where Brown would merge his small herd of sheep with Perkins's larger one. The family moved to Akron, where John could tend the sheep, supervise shearing, and send wool to distributors in the Northeast. Perkins also rented Brown a house for $30 a year. This began to turn life around for John, at least for the moment. He became financially stable, able to send money to 2 of his children, John Jr. and Ruth, who attended Grand River Institute. Brown wrote that, "Divine Providence seems to smile on our works at this time. I think this is the most comfortable and the most favorable arrangement of my worldly concerns that I have ever had, and calculated to afford us more leisure for improvement by day and by night than any other. I do hope that God has enabled us to make it in mercy to us, and not that he should send leanness into our soul." Brown managed around 1,500 sheep, and although a good judge of wool, his herdsman abilities lacked considerable knowledge. He tended to them lovingly, but could not get them to mind. Brown also acted as an agent, sent around the region to acquire new sheep or sell others. John Brown was very much a man of his time. A growing labor movement covered the country, with labor unions springing up to combat companies who took advantage of their workers. Brown saw this in the wool industry, where he believed large purchasers and growers conspired together to pay low prices for excellent quality wool. Taking advantage of the public, whether slaves or free, irritated John to a great degree, so he proposed a plan to Perkins. He would travel east to Springfield, Massachusetts, and open up a wool distribution center. Brown would warehouse wool from growers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, and Virginia, sort the wool, and price it according to quality, and then arrange for sales to Eastern companies. Brown, for his expert eye for wool, would receive 2 cents per pound of wool sorted and sold. Perkins agreed to the investment plan, and in June 1846, Brown, with his sons Jason and John Jr., moved to Springfield and began the operation. In November that year, Brown's family notified him that his youngest daughter, Amelia, died from being scalded to death in a household accident. Aside from the death of Amelia, Brown's life looked great, especially the business in Springfield. He and his sons processed around 300 tons of wool, while Brown also neatly kept the account books. Even though the business looked great from the outside, inside it possessed great struggles due to John Brown himself. A businessman who knew Brown in Springfield said, Uncle John was no trader. He waited until his wools were graded, then fixed a price. If this suited the manufacturers, they took the fleeces. If not, they bought elsewhere, and Uncle John had to submit finally to a much less price than he could have got. Yet he was a scrupulously honest and upright man, hard and inflexible, but everybody had just what belonged to him. Brown was in a position to make a fortune, and a regular bred merchant would have done so, but, as I said, it was a failure. One of his biographers stated, Brown was driven by a deep bitterness against what he regarded as exploitive corporations. Having long been a shepherd and farmer, he saw such rural workers as innocent pawns of scheming capitalists. Never a capitalist himself, he now launched his own war against those who he believed were taking advantage of farmers. John Brown had his own model, one allied with what today would be called a producers' cooperative, in which producers organized for mutual support and financial equity. In a widely distributed circular titled To Wool Growers, Brown stated that as the middleman between farmers and capitalists, he could gain fair treatment for producers of wool. His inflexible nature made him stick to his desired price and not budge, even when the market demanded it. An 1846 tariff passed by Congress reduced the taxes on imported wool and drove the prices of wool lower than Brown was willing to sell them, wanting to get the best price for the wool people entrusted him with. Brown refused to engage in cutthroat competition, and this ultimately became his downfall, that and the fact that he was often clueless about available funds. After 10 months of business, Brown moved his family to Springfield and lived in very humble abodes. Much of the money they could spare went to support black families who they helped escape north. By 1849, the wool business Brown started began to fall apart and go into debt because of his bullheadedness. That characteristic also brought him into conflict with a craze going around the country at the time, hypnotism. Brown doubted the ability of hypnotists, and when the famed hypnotist Leroy Sunderland performed one of his shows, John Brown stood up and pronounced the affair a humbug and challenged him to a demonstration. Brown asserted that tolerance to pain revolved around a person's willpower, not being hypnotized. So they scheduled a demonstration where Sunderland drug a nettle across the skin around John Brown's neck, who remained stoic in his chair. Then Sunderland drug it across a hypnotized woman, who did not flinch. Only when Sunderland released her from the hypnotism did she scream, before putting her back under. Next, Sunderland put a vial of ammonia under Brown's nose, which sent him reeling backward. He did the same to the lady, and she again did not budge. Brown composed himself until he got out of the auditorium. Then he clawed his neck in pain and remained up all night suffering from the nettle. The next morning, he wrote a letter to the local paper saying that there may be something to hypnotism. John always thought about the African American community, and when he learned of a large parcel of land purchased by a wealthy anti-slavery reformer named Garrett Smith for the settlement of free blacks and fugitive slaves, Brown purchased a 244-acre plot at $1 an acre from Smith with the intention of helping fugitive slaves obtain a place to live and to help them farm. Smith's town was called North Elba in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. Brown moved his family to North Elba while he ran the wool business in Springfield. With the price of wool dropping, Brown devised a plan to sell his product in Europe. He sailed with some of his wool to Liverpool, then continued to London. He attempted to sell his wool, but eventually it would go up at auction. While he waited, he traveled across the Channel to France, visiting Paris and discussing wool trade with one of their larger firms. They agreed to travel to London to view his product. Then Brown traveled to Brussels, Hamburg, Switzerland, and Italy. During his journey, he visited the Waterloo battlefield and viewed multiple military reviews for various countries. When he returned to England, he found his wool sold at auction for lower than his prices in the United States. To rub salt in the wound, he found that an American company that he did business with purchased his wool for 52 cents per pound. For the same wool, they offered to pay 60 cents per pound for in Springfield. Again, Brown lost money in this venture, this time to the tune of $40,000. The only good event that occurred on his European trip came when Brown won a medal for some Saxony sheep he brought with him at the World Fair in London, and when wool purchasers tested his knowledge of the fiber and attempted to trick him with poodle hair, Brown examined the hair and said, "Gentlemen, if you have any machinery that will work up dog's hair, I would advise you to put this into it." His expertise in grading and identification were superb, but that did not help his business acumen. In October 1850, Brown closed the Perkins and Brown agency. He traveled around the region paying his creditors what he could and placating the others. Brown spent much of 1851 and 1852 in legal cases for the wool distribution business. Perkins funded Brown's trips over the Northeast representing the company, but only zapped funds and energy from Brown. On April 26, 1852, Brown lost another child, an infant son, the seventh child out of 13 children from his second marriage to die. Also around this time, his children's piousness came into question. John Jr. and Jason became agnostic, and some of the younger children became skeptical of religion. As always, in Calvinistic fashion, Brown blamed himself for his children straying away from the religion. To one of his son's letters, he replied with a 6-page sermon invoking Old Testament rhetoric about backsliding and false prophets. By 1853, he found himself in Ohio, attempting to reunite the partnership with Perkins, but it ultimately ended on good terms. But Perkins did not want to do business with John Brown. Brown needed to travel to North Elba but possessed no funds to make the journey. So he rented a farm to grow crops to sell, but most of his crops got wiped out by a drought. While he labored away in Ohio, his 20th and last child was born, a girl named Ellen, named after the infant who passed away 5 years prior. In the winter, he moved back to North Elba as poor as ever. His time in Springfield only boosted his resolve for a plan to free the enslaved peoples of the United States. He shared the idea with the free black community of Springfield and other cities in the Northeast. Many were receptive, and it gained a lot of attention. One of those who took an interest in Brown's plan to invade the South was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who escaped his bondage in 1838. In November 1847, he went to the Brown house, and he and Brown sat at the dinner table for 7 hours discussing his plan to liberate the enslaved. They spread a map out on the table, and Brown pointed out the Appalachian Mountains and said, "These mountains were placed here to aid the emancipation of your race. They are full of natural forts, where one man for defense could be equal to 100 for attack. They are also full of good hiding places, where a large number of men could be concealed and baffle and elude pursuit for a long time. I know these mountains well and could take a band of men into them and keep them there in spite of all the efforts of Virginia to dislodge me and drive me out." The plan was for 25 hand-picked men to divide up into 5 groups of 5 stationed in a southward direction along the mountain range. Periodically, the groups would liberate plantations close to them, taking the stout and able-bodied into their ranks, arming them with weapons to continue the work, while the others, unable to fight, would be sent north on what Brown called the subterranean passway. Eventually, a free black colony would live in the mountains and periodically adding to their ranks and liberating the slaves of Virginia gradually. He did not envision a general slave insurrection, but simply liberation. But if the shedding of blood was necessary by the retreating liberators against their pursuers, he was for it. He stated, "No people could have self-respect or be respected who would not fight for their freedom. Besides, slavery was a state of war to which the slaves were unwilling parties, and consequently they have a right to anything necessary to their peace and freedom." Douglass was fascinated but dubious. Why the recourse to violence? Might not the South be persuaded to abandon slavery through peaceful means? No, Brown insisted. He knew the Southerners' proud hearts, and they would never be induced to give up their slaves until they felt a big stick about their heads. Wouldn't the slave owners pursue Brown's men with dogs and guns? Yes, Brown answered, but through crafty use of caves and precipices, we would whip them. Brown told Douglass that he had been formulating his plan for years, and that all he needed was the funds and the plan would go into action. The first conversation with Brown intrigued Douglass. He was amazed at his sympathy for the enslaved. He wrote in his newspaper, "Though a white gentleman, is in sympathy a black man, and as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery." Now, in the 1850s, the plan seemed more likely of a possibility as more and more Americans came over to the anti-slavery stance, and more of them grew supportive of forcible liberation of slaves in the South. John Brown's plan to arm runaway slaves to end the bondage present in the South did not start with discussions with Frederick Douglass. When the Compromise of 1850 led to stricter laws towards runaway slaves, Brown turned his wool warehouse, while he still controlled it, into a location along the Underground Railroad and to combat slave hunters, he formed the League of Gileadites. Brown organized this group of black men, women, and children to physically fight men who traveled north to reclaim runaway slaves. Brown told them, "Do not delay one moment after you are ready. You will lose all your resolution if you do. Let the first blow be the signal for all to engage, and when engaged, do not do your work by halves, but make clean work with your enemies, and be sure you meddle not with any others." If a member was captured and taken to trial, those on trial should create an explosion in the courtroom and whisk away the prisoners to safety during the confusion. What he was saying was revolutionary at the time for a white man to fully endorse the violent acts and murders of slave catchers and call for whites to assist in their concealment against federal law. The fact that he included women and even children in the fight for equal rights is also revolutionary. He was a supporter of women's rights. His daughter recalled that he traveled far and wide to hear the women's rights activists of the time speak, and inside his home, all children shared tasks equally without adhering to gender stereotypes. The boys and girls did chores indoors and outdoors. Frederick Douglass was surprised to find the sons of the family serving food and washing dishes when he had his dinner with them. At the Brown home in North Elba, the family eked out a meager living in the mountainous terrain. The out-of-the-way location was chosen by Garrett Smith because he felt the northern cities would feel uneasy about a large population of free blacks living near them. At North Elba in 1850, the Brown family owned $500 worth of property. It was basically a subsistence lifestyle, making very little to sell to the outside market. More than just wanting to help African Americans cultivate a community and crops, the local whites, who were taken aback by the sudden appearance of the black community, overcharged the black community for goods. Brown attempted to step in and right as many wrongs as possible. 1854 was a big year for the Browns, and it is directly tied with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act by Congress. That legislative body wanted to create states out of the territories acquired from the Louisiana Purchase. As people moved west, they began to settle in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and as the population grew, they would meet the required number of people to create their own state. However, a big question came up. Would Kansas or Nebraska be free or slave? As per the agreement in the Missouri Compromise, any state above the 3630 parallel should be free, but slave states sought to bring more states and senators in on their side of slavery. Thus, popular sovereignty was introduced by Stephen Douglas as a way to settle the situation. The people of the proposed state would simply vote on whether they would accept slavery or not. This resulted in pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers moving into the Kansas Territory to give their voting power to their respective sides. 3 of the Brown children traveled to Kansas as a way to fight against slavery and to start a new life in an area with new opportunities. Owen, Frederick, and Salmon Brown left their homes in Ohio for Kansas in 1854. With 10 cattle, 3 horses, and some personal possessions, first going to Illinois, wintering there, and arriving in Kansas by April 1855, about 8 miles from the town of Osawatomie. The 3 sons would not be alone long. John Jr. and Jason would make their way to Kansas that spring. They traveled by boat aboard the New Lucy. Cholera broke out among the passengers, and Jason's oldest child, Austin, would pass away. When the boat stopped in Waverly, Missouri, the Browns disembarked and buried Austin in a thunderstorm. But when they returned to the boat, the ship's captain pulled away, leaving them stranded in Missouri. The captain was needlessly cruel, since he knew that the family had gotten off for the purpose of burying their loved one, and that the family had tickets to travel as far as Kansas City. They would travel by wagon, facing discrimination for being anti-slavery and Northerners along the way. But they would arrive at the camp outside of Osawatomie that the family called Brown Station on May 7th. John Brown thought hard about joining his family in Kansas, but other things were on his mind. In 1854, he had started recruiting for a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry to take place very soon. Having dedicated his life to the destruction of slavery, Brown asked his black neighbors in North Elba and even Frederick Douglass, along with other prominent African Americans, how he could best help them. He began to think that he could help African Americans as a whole by traveling to Kansas. Other things drove him toward the idea of going to Kansas. His son John Jr. requested that his father raise money for guns and send them to Kansas because the violence was getting worse as more people flooded into the territory. John raised money for weapons at a convention of reformers called the Radical Political Abolitionists in Syracuse, New York, in June 1855. He set off on his journey to Kansas with his son-in-law Henry Thompson in August, stopping in Ohio to pick up more weapons, including revolvers, rifles, ammunition, and several short, heavy broadswords. They loaded all the supplies into wagons, bought a horse for $160 in Chicago, then proceeded overland. Along the way, their horse got sick, forcing them to only travel 6 to 8 miles a day. Running low on funds, they ate crackers, eggs, and prairie chickens they shot along the way. They stopped in Waverly to exhume the body of Austin to give him a proper burial in Kansas. They arrived in Brown Station on October 7th, where they found that torrential rains had ruined many crops and illness plagued the whole camp. By November, he helped obtain crude homes for his children to get them out of the elements. They had lived in tents for most of 1855. The family was in a good state by that month. In the fight against slavery, Brown would have a strong opponent. A former senator of Missouri and pro-slavery activist, David Rice Atchison, helped to organize and induce Missourians to cross the border into Kansas, vote illegally, and terrorize abolitionists. A pro-slavery Missouri leader said to the border ruffians, "To those who have qualms of conscience as to violating the laws, state or national, I say the time has come when such impositions must be disregarded, since your rights and property are in danger, and I advise you, one and all, to enter every election district in Kansas and vote at the point of the Bowie knife and revolver." Enough fraud took place that 38 of the 40 Kansas representatives were pro-slavery. Those pro-slavery politicians implemented strict laws against the abolitionists, making it a felony to speak out against slavery. This is not to say that all those who came as anti-slavery to Kansas were like John Brown. Most opposed slavery because they did not want African Americans in the state of Kansas, whether free or slave. The discussions by free state groups in Kansas bear this out. When the Brown family were approached soon after they arrived in Kansas by some border ruffians, the men from Missouri asked which side they fell on. John Jr. stunned them by saying they were free state men, and more than that, we are abolitionists. They, unlike many other free staters, opposed slavery for moral reasons. In November 1855, Charles Dow, a Free State Ohioan, was shot in the back by Franklin N. Coleman, a pro-slavery Alabamian. The squabble originated from Coleman cutting timber on Dow's land, but because the two men were on opposite sides of this civil war in Kansas, it quickly became political. Jacob Branson, the only witness to the murder, was anti-slavery, so the pro-slavery sheriff arrested Branson on false charges and set a high bail to prevent him from testifying against Coleman. Free Staters rescued Branson and brought him to safety in Lawrence, and this would result in what became known as the Wakarusa War, the first conflict in which John Brown participated. Pro-slavery supporters planned to attack Lawrence, and word got to Brown, who came into Lawrence with some of his sons riding in a wagon bordered with poles with bayonets attached to them. After talking with Free State leaders, he was appointed a captain in the 1st Brigade of Kansas Volunteers, commanding a company of men called the Liberty Guards. Before he could get a taste of battle, the governor of the territory got both sides to stand down, but tensions would flare up again. In 1856, at the Osawatomie Free State Convention, candidates were chosen to represent Kansas, of which John Jr. was recommended. John Brown served as a chairman of the convention as they prepared for possible violence as new elections were to take place. The country, and Kansas in particular, entered 1856 with controversy, and it would continue throughout the year. 1856 was the year of the infamous Pottawatomie Massacre perpetrated by John Brown. One of Brown's biographers put it best when he stated, "Larger forces contributed to the massacre. John Brown was no designing troublemaker. If anything, he had ended 1855 with an overly optimistic view of the Kansas situation, which he thought had moved clearly to the Free State side. Nor was his deed simply an act of revenge against his enemies in Kansas. It can best be explained as an act of terrorism improvised at a moment when outside forces, some local and recent, others national and long developing, converged in his psyche and set off within him an explosion of vindictive rage. Earlier that year, a Free Stater was brutally hacked with hatchets and knives, left mortally wounded on his doorstep with his wife screaming in horror. Also that year, the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, officially supported the pro-slavery government, even though the territory was shifting or had shifted to anti-slavery. He even called up troops to enter Kansas. John Jr., upset about the turn of events, wrote, "The question here is, shall we here be freemen or slaves? The South is arming and sending in their men. The North is doing the same thing. It is now decreed and certain that the slave power must desist from its aggressive acts upon the settlers of Kansas, or if they do not, the war cry heard upon our plains will reverberate not only through the hemp and tobacco fields of Missouri, but through the rice swamps, the cotton and sugar plantations of the sunny South. Early in 1856, President Franklin Pierce began to side or at least support the pro-slavery government in Kansas by proclaiming the pro-slavery government legitimate and that opposition to it would be considered treason. At a meeting held by Free Soilers in Osawatomie in April, a group discussed a way to oppose the pro-slavery laws and the government in Kansas. They also discussed not paying taxes as a way to fight back against federal government decisions. John Brown got up and stated he was an abolitionist of the old stock, was dyed in the wool, and that blacks were his brothers and equals, that he would rather see this union dissolved and the country drenched with blood than to pay taxes to the amount of 1/100th part of a mill. His statement about equality infuriated many of the group of Free Soilers. Just because they opposed slavery did not mean that they sought equality. Brown was an outlier. Reverend Martin White got up and walked out in disgust at Brown's statement and would eventually join the pro-slavery side of the conflict. The Browns quickly got a reputation as ardent abolitionists, and a warrant went out for their arrest. John went to find out if the pro-slavery judge Sterling Cato would stand by the warrants, so he sent 2 of his sons to enter the tavern which acted as the courtroom for Osawatomie. The judge did not order them arrested, but the court did pass sentences and punish abolitionists for petty crimes. When the Browns and 30 men armed entered the parade ground as part of the Potawatomi Rifles, the court broke up and the judge never again held court at Osawatomie. On May 21st, around 750 pro-slavery supporters formed and attacked Lawrence, Kansas, destroying the town by burning its buildings and destroying property, like the printing press of the anti-slavery newspaper. The Browns heard about this destruction and the attack on the anti-slavery movement in Kansas and rode with members of the Potawatomi Rifles to attack the ruffians who attacked Lawrence. As they proceeded, word got to them of the caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks. Senator Sumner had delivered a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he stated that Senator Butler was in love with the harlot slavery. Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, took exception to this verbal attack and began beating him with a cane. Brooks would say of the pummeling, "Every lick went where I intended. For about the first 4 or 5 licks, he offered to make a fight, but I plied him so rapidly that he did not touch me. Towards the last, he bellowed like a calf. I wore my cane out completely, but saved the head, which is gold. The fragments of the cane are begged for as sacred relics. Every Southern man is delighted, and the abolitionists are like a hive of disturbed bees. They are making all sorts of threats. It would not take much to have the throats of every abolitionist cut." John Brown was incensed by the news. What happened next would be a combination of the attacks and counterattacks by anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces in Kansas, all of which enraged Brown as he saw the country given in to pro-slavery forces. On Saturday, May 24, 1856, Brown led a group of his sons and a few friends armed with rifles, revolvers, and freshly sharpened broadswords to a house on Potawatomi Creek. They knocked on the door, attempting to draw out the man, but a rifle barrel protruded through a hole in the house and the party left. Next, they came to the house of James Doyle, a Tennessean who came to Kansas to get away from the financially dominated area by slaveholders, but joined the pro-slavery supporters in Kansas. Doyle and 2 sons were on Cato's pro-slavery court that the Browns broke up. The Browns knocked on the door asking for directions. When the door opened, they barged in, accusing Doyle of pro-slavery actions, then took him and his 2 oldest sons outside the cabin. They spared the 16-year-old son, leaving him in the house with his frightened mother and sisters, because he had not been part of the court. The Browns led the 3 men toward the woods 200 yards away. Then Owen and Salmon Brown hacked away at them with the broadswords, and John Brown delivered a single pistol shot into the head of James to make sure he was dead. The next home they came to was Allen Wilkinson's home, the acting district attorney in Cato's court. They got him to come out of the house by asking him to show them how to get to Dutch Henry Sherman's cabin. When he opened the door, the party took hold of him and asked him his stance on slavery. When he identified that he was for it, the group said he would be taken as a prisoner. Allen attempted to extricate himself from the situation by stating that his wife had the measles and needed someone to stay with her, and that if he was allowed to leave to get someone, he would be willing to turn himself into the group. John Brown asked the wife if there was any neighbor available to look after her. She said they were all away. John said it matters not, and took her husband out of the cabin, about 150 yards away, where John's son-in-law and a friend of the family did the same to Allen as the Brown sons did to the Doyles. Next, they waded across the creek to the home of James Harris, where they hoped to find Dutch Henry Sherman, a German immigrant and ardent pro-slavery supporter who owned the tavern where the court took place and had many run-ins with the Browns. Fortunately for him, he was on the prairie searching for lost cattle. They did find his brother Bill Sherman, along with some others in the cabin. They interrogated the group, and finding only Bill guilty of pro-slavery actions, they took him outside, slashed him with the broadswords, and submerged his dead body in the creek. The Browns and the rest of the party washed the blood off their broadswords and headed back to their camp on Middle Ottawa Creek. The reality set in of what they had done when they made it back to camp. Some of them broke down and cried, even though John tried to insist that it was in self-defense to defend others against violence. John Jr. and Jason ran to a family member's house, although they hadn't taken part in the killings. Word spread that the Browns were the ones who committed it, and they feared for their lives. Eventually, both John Jr. and Jason were captured by pro-slavery forces and turned over to federal soldiers. Both men were put in chains and beaten by their captors. John Jr. was overcome with madness, as people then described it, and had to be restrained. At one point, the two men were taken to Osawatomie to a camp, and John Jr. had to be bound to a pole by an ox chain, and when he wouldn't stop shrieking, the soldiers beat him into unconsciousness. Them and 5 other Free Staters were bound together by chains to their ankles and forced to walk 65 miles to Lecompton. Once there, the 2 men were investigated and Jason was released, but John Jr. was charged with high treason for being a Free State politician. When Jason returned to his home, he found that pro-slavery forces had burned his cabin like the rest of the Brown family homes. John Jr. will be released on bail in September. It would be in the days after the Potawatomi Massacre that John Brown would meet one of the more influential men for his own story. James Redpath, a writer for the New York Tribune, stumbled on Brown's camp. The Tribune was an anti-slavery paper, and Brown was more than happy to tell him what he was fighting for, leaving out the massacre. Redpath would go on to be Brown's first biographer. While hidden in the wilderness, Brown got word that Henry Pate, a leader of a pro-slavery group of armed men, the same man who captured both John Jr. and Jason, was planning an attack on a town. Determined to stop it, Brown and his 8 men left their hideout and met up with 20 other Free State men at Prairie City, where they partook in religious services. While in church, a messenger burst into the building, telling them that the Missourians were coming. 6 men attacked the town, but the Free Staters fought them off, capturing 3 of them and riding off for an area known as Blackjack for the stand of Blackjack Oaks. The slave state forces numbered 55, outnumbering Brown's men. In the battle, the Free Staters couldn't hit the slave staters from behind their wagon barricade, but they did manage to hit their horses, making the group of men immobile. Brown was winning the battle, but an unlikely event captured the victory. Frederick Brown, the burly son of John, who was supposed to take care of the horses, came riding Owen's horse, wielding a sword and urging the Free Staters on, saying the Missourians are surrounded. Terrified that what he said was true, Pate and his group surrendered to Frederick and John Brown. A few days after the battle, Brown ran into federal troops led by future Union General Colonel Edwin Sumner. Among the federal soldiers was a young officer named Jeb Stuart. Stuart and Brown would meet again a few years later. Brown handed over his prisoners to the federal troops, but Sumner did not arrest Brown, even though there was a warrant for his arrest. On into August, Brown and his group raided a few pro-slavery locations for supplies to keep up the war effort, but on his trip to Nebraska City in the Nebraska Territory, he would meet one of his die-hard followers. Aaron Dwight Stevens was a commander in the Free State Army. Stevens had fought in the Mexican-American War and fought Native Americans afterward. In early 1856, he had been jailed in New Mexico for rebelling against an officer. He escaped and made his way to Kansas to fight for the anti-slavery side of the conflict. He would remain by Brown's side for the rest of their lives. In Nebraska City, much of his group split up. Of his sons, only Jason and Frederick stayed with him. Some went to Iowa, others to Ohio, and some went to North Elba. Despite his group of followers getting smaller, his legend grew in the minds of slave staters. They envisioned him everywhere in the territory, terrorizing them around every bend of the road. The mere rumor that John Brown was coming caused pro-slavery meetings to dissipate. He continued to attack slavery in Kansas, but because of the Potawatomi Massacre, he was forced to travel in secret. August and September of 1856 would see Kansas hit a new high for violence. President Franklin Pierce put John W. Geary as the territorial governor, and his anti-slavery stance caused an uproar with the pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. From the time of his appointment in July until he arrived in September, pro-slavery forces were determined to get rid of all Free Staters in the territory. They launched a brutal and violent war against the Free Staters, with one newspaper describing the roads strewn with the dead bodies of Free Staters. Brown formed his own group to combat the pro-slavery forces. He would call his group the Kansas Regulars, and he would go to literal war with the slave staters. Brown raided pro-slavery farms and took what he and his group needed to continue the fight against slavery, believing that if it belonged to pro-slavery families, it could be confiscated to fight against slavery. He captured a great deal of pro-slavery soldiers, but almost immediately let them go, but not before lecturing them about how their side of the war was wrong. He stated, "You want to make or keep other people slaves. Do you not know that your wicked efforts will end in making slaves of yourselves? You come here to make this a slave state. You are fighting against liberty, which our revolutionary fathers fought to establish in this republic, where all men should be free and equal, with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, you are traitors to liberty and to your country of the worst kind, and deserve to be hung to the nearest tree. Go in peace. Go home and tell your neighbors and friends of your mistake. We deprive you only of your arms, and do that only lest some of you are not yet converted to the right." On August 29th, John Brown and his group led 150 head of cattle toward the town of Osawatomie, but stopped on the hills overlooking the town. The next morning, the pro-slavery forces advanced toward the town, killing Brown's son Frederick. The young man had spent the evening with some family and friends away from the group and was shot down in the road by Reverend Martin White. News came to John Brown of the impending attack, and they rode off for the town. An untested member of the group confessed that he had never been under fire. Brown gave him some advice: take more care to end life well than to live long. He placed his 38 men in the tree line, concealed from view. When the pro-slavery soldiers got close, Brown ordered his men to fire. This stunned the slave staters, who numbered around 200 men. Brown's Kansas regulars killed between 20 and 30 and wounded at least 40. The slave staters charged into the woods, scattering Brown's men, but many of them got away, having caused a great deal of damage to the enemy. The pro-slavery soldiers then turned their anger on the town of Osawatomie, burning it to the ground. This was a defeat for John Brown, but he would gain a great reputation from the battle. He would earn the nickname Osawatomie Brown and show the world that Northern abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates were not cowards who shirked away from a fight. His resistance to slavery and its advocates demonstrated the Northerners' resolve, gaining him nationwide attention. The South portrayed him as a pariah, but the North saw him as a hero for standing up to slavery. Governor Geary arrived in September and immediately ordered the disbanding of all armed groups, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. He was also lenient towards those who had committed murder, by basically saying to let things go and start over. The persistence of Geary and the fear put in pro-slavery forces by John Brown helped settle the tension within the territory. By the end of September, anti-slavery supporters raised an untold amount of money to help anti-slavery forces and residents in Kansas. The National Kansas Committee alone raised $85,000 in cash and over $100,000 in supplies for immigrants to Kansas. John Brown wanted to take advantage of that influx of cash to fund his anti-slavery ventures, specifically his invasion of the South. He would use the country's concern over Kansas to raise money for his other projects. Brown left Kansas in a wagon with 3 of his sons, John Jr., Jason, and Owen. After crossing the Nebraska border, Brown came down with a fever and became a guest at the home of a Quaker named Jonas Jones. After a week of recuperating, he felt good enough to travel east, first to Chicago, and then Ohio, New York, and by January 1857, he arrived in Boston, Massachusetts. There, he met with Franklin B. Sanborn, the secretary of the Massachusetts State Kansas Committee. Sanborn was instantly impressed by this tall, slender, and commanding figure. who bore a brown broadcloth suit, a high leather collar, and gray overcoat with a cape. With his military bearing and intense Calvinism, he seemed to combine the soldier and the deacon. Brown appeared to be of the unmixed Puritan breed, a modern Oliver Cromwell, thought Sanborn. The secretary introduced Brown to influential abolitionists, including Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Theodore Parker. Parker had gained notoriety as a clergyman so liberal that he was forced to preach in the Boston Music Hall instead of in a church. From a doctrine point of view, Parker and Brown were apart, but they were together on the ideas of slavery. During a reception in Boston, Brown also met the famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. However, their diverse stances on violence kept them apart. Garrison advocated for nonviolence and used the Bible to advocate for nonviolence to deal with slavery. Brown would quote the Old Testament to argue for taking up arms against slavery. Brown met with Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, who in his younger days fought in Greece's revolution to break away from Turkey and fought in Poland's rebellion against Russia. Upon his return to America, he became a pioneer in the treatment of the mentally and physically challenged, and together with his wife Julia Ward Howe, was involved in many reforms, including anti-slavery. It was Howe that secured Brown 200 Sharps rifles, ammunition, and the promise of $500 in expenses. George Stearns, the president of the Massachusetts State Kansas Committee, took to Brown immediately, eager for his family to meet this already famed abolitionist. He took Brown to his estate named Evergreens. Despite his rough appearance, Stearns' wife was struck by him. She would state that Brown had such an erect military bearing, such fine courtesy of demeanor, and grave earnestness, that he seemed to my instant thought some old Cromwellian hero suddenly dropped down before me. While with Stearns, Brown regaled them with stories about the Battle of Blackjack and other battles with pro-slavery forces. The Stearns' 12-year-old son became so invigorated by the story that he handed Brown the money in his pocket, asking him to buy something for the poor people of Kansas, and then asked Brown to send him a letter describing his time as a child. When he left the Stearns' house, he then traveled to visit Charles Sumner, the man who was pummeled by Preston Brooks on the floor of the Senate the previous May. Sumner was still in pain from the beating, but met with Brown. During the meeting, Brown asked if he could see the jacket that Sumner was wearing when he was beaten. Sumner showed him the jacket. Brown said nothing, just stared intently at the bloody-stained garment, itself a symbol of the violence perpetrated by pro-slavery supporters on abolitionists. On January 24th, Brown met with the National Kansas Committee, and some of them proposed a resolution to give Brown $5,000 for his troops in Kansas. However, some of the members stated that Brown should not get the money because he might use it recklessly, then asked him if he was planning on attacking slave states. Brown stated, "I am no adventurer. You all know me. You are acquainted with my history. You know what I have done in Kansas. I do not expose my plans. No one knows them but myself, except perhaps one. I will not be interrogated. If you wish to give me anything, give it freely. I have no other purpose but to serve the cause of liberty." Although they agreed to give him $5,000 to be drawn up for defensive measures, Brown only ended up with $150 because they ran low on funds. Brown then traveled to see his family in North Elba, staying there just a short time before heading off for Massachusetts, where Sanborn had arranged for him to address the Massachusetts state legislature, who was about to vote on a $100,000 appropriations bill for Kansas. On February 18th, Osawatomie John Brown got up in front of the legislature and delivered a heartfelt and appropriate speech where he recounted the horrendous cruelties perpetrated by pro-slavery forces on anti-slavery citizens of Kansas, even holding up shackles and talking about his son, saying, "Here is the chain with which one of them was confined, after the cruelty, sufferings, and anxiety he underwent had rendered him a maniac, yes, a maniac." He also spoke about the death of his son Frederick, describing the scene in gory detail. He went on to state that Kansas needed good men, industrious men, men who respect themselves, who act only from the dictates of conscience, men who fear God too much to fear anything human. His pleading did not sway the legislature. They voted down the appropriations bill. Nevertheless, he persisted. He took donations for his anti-slavery work in any form, many times after speeches. He got $80 in Canton and Collinsville, Connecticut, and $70 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He made a contact in Collinsville that would impact his future plans. Charles Blair, a blacksmith in town, made a pike for him, a double-edged bowie knife attached to a 6-foot pole that Brown thought would make good defensive weapons for the people in Kansas. He signed a contract with Blair for 1,000 pikes, but could only secure partial payment, so the pikes would remain undelivered until 1859. Brown saw the pike as the best weapon for those untrained in firearms and hoped that freed slaves could use them in his future plans to liberate the slaves of the South. This promotional tour garnered Brown his most important supporters, those whom he first met on his trip from Kansas to New England. They would be called the Secret Six, his largest backers. George Stearns, a prominent businessman and industrialist who invited Brown to his home, Evergreens, supported Brown financially through his ventures. Gerrit Smith, the wealthy individual who started North Elba, became a good friend of Brown and would continue to fight slavery through Brown's actions. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was a Unitarian minister and social reformer who organized groups of immigrants from the Northeast to settle in Kansas in order to add weight to the anti-slavery population. Theodore Parker was another Unitarian minister and social reformer, but more radical in his views. As stated earlier, he was prevented from preaching his more liberal religious views in many churches. Samuel Gridley Howe, the adventurer, soldier, and physician, took part in many social reform movements and was an ardent abolitionist. Franklin B. Sanborn attended and graduated from Harvard and became the author of numerous studies of transcendentalism and transcendentalists. Collectively, the Secret Six funded and helped fundraise for John Brown and his plans to free slaves and hopefully end the institution of slavery. Four of the six were directly involved in the transcendentalism movement, alongside the heavy hitters of that movement like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Many of the transcendentalists were pacifists, but many began to side with Brown when it came to violence to end the institution of slavery, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 took effect. Many transcendentalists became violent against slave hunters who ventured north because of that law to put African American men and women into bondage again. They openly endorsed violence against those people and took part in it. As John roamed around the Northeast looking for money to fund his war against slavery, his family existed in near poverty in North Elba. When a supporter said he would like to contribute funds to Brown's effort, John requested $1,000 to purchase a piece of land next to his property in North Elba in order to sustain his family if something should happen to him. The supporter backed away when Brown requested such a large amount, but did affirm that Brown's family would not go hungry if something should happen to him. Despite that setback, a 160-acre plot was purchased by the family from contributions by many people from the Northeast. In March, John Brown would meet an important figure in his life, Hugh Forbes, a British soldier who fought with Garibaldi during the Italian Revolution. Forbes's book, Duties of a Soldier, impressed Brown, and Brown would hire him as a drill instructor for his troops he planned to battle slavery with. Forbes hated slavery and was in full support of arming African Americans. Brown would hire Forbes for $100 a month, a generous wage in the 19th century. But Forbes would dawdle and not travel to the Iowa training camp until August, 4 months after Brown put him on the payroll. Since his exploits in Kansas, Brown had avoided arrest. He got word that a U.S. Marshal was on his way to arrest him, so he hid with an unsuspicious abolitionist family, barricading himself in an upstairs room until his trail ran cold. By not making speeches, Brown's funds began to dry up, and he despaired that his plans would fall apart. He wrote a letter called Old Brown's Farewell. Brown announced that he was returning to Kansas with a feeling of deepest sadness. He had tried mightily to arm and equip his Minutemen, who had suffered hunger, cold, nakedness, and some of the sickness, wounds, imprisonment, and irons while fighting for a cause in which every man, woman, and child of the entire human family has a deep and awful interest. Brown lamented that he could not secure, amidst all the wealth, luxury, and extravagance of his heaven-exalted people, even the necessary supplies of the common soldiers. His sad address worked to garner more funds, but he needed to set off for the West. After a brief stay with his family, he headed to Iowa, where he was hoping to train an army to march into Kansas and win it for the anti-slavery side. Ultimately, all of the fundraising amounted to around $30,000, but only $2,500 was actual cash. The rest was supplies. So when he made it to Iowa, he only had $25 to his name. However, the journey wasn't a total loss. Brown had worked to raise funds for the war in Kansas, but when he returned to the territory in August 1857, he found that the violence had been greatly reduced. Governor Geary had been conciliatory when Buchanan replaced him with Robert J. Walker of Mississippi. The new governor acted in a similarly judicious manner as Geary. The elections held in the territory also benefited the anti-slavery side. He had plenty of weapons, but no men and no cause for which to fight in Kansas. He stayed in Iowa for 3 months, suffering from malarial fever and a back injury, and awaited news of violence in Kansas. Despite the lack of need for his services, Brown turned his attention toward his Harper's Ferry plan. Forbes met with Brown in August to discuss their invasion of the South. However, they differed on how to proceed. Brown had great faith in the African Americans he planned to free. He believed that they would be good fighters and fight for their freedom. Forbes had his doubts about their capabilities. John Brown felt that 25 to 50 men, black and white, could start off the insurrection that would free all the slaves in the South. Within 24 hours, between 200 and 500 freed slaves would join their ranks and hide in the Appalachian Mountains, where they could resist pursuers. Those unaccustomed to firearms could use pikes, knives, swords, and other instruments to wage war against their former oppressors. With anarchy raging throughout the South as Brown and his party used the mountains to free more slaves, Northern allies would propose anti-slavery legislation, and Southern politicians would support it to stop the violence. Forbes had his doubts about the plan. He thought that without foreknowledge of the invasion, blacks would not join the cause out of fear of retribution, so the attempt would be a feeble one. Forbes suggested that the invasion force be made up of hand-chosen white men who would launch raids from the Virginia-Maryland border region, liberating slaves and sending them north to Canada. If this was kept up once or twice a month, Southerners would want rid of slavery. Brown saw Forbes' plan as too timid and began to have doubts about the Englishman. With the violence dying down in Kansas, Brown sought to recruit for his Harper's Ferry plan, so he began to scout Kansas for possible recruits. He summoned John E. Cook, a 27-year-old Connecticut man who fought with Brown after the Battle of Blackjack. He met with Brown about Harper's Ferry and was joined by other veterans of the Kansas conflict, including Aaron Dwight Stevens. Brown recruited 10 men in all, including himself. When he told them that the destination was Virginia and that they were to drill with Forbes at a military camp in Ohio, they balked at the idea, thinking they were signing up to fight only in Kansas and Missouri. After Brown calmed their fears and answered their questions, they agreed to go to Virginia. Brown began sending his supplies and material east in preparation for the attack. On December 4th, the group left Iowa to travel to Ohio by foot. As they traveled, around the campfire, the men would discuss slavery and abolitionism. They would also discuss philosophy, Shakespeare, Mormonism, Islam, and Greek mythology. Other than Brown and Cook, the rest of the group were not church-going Christians. Many of them were agnostic, including John Kagi and Brown's own son, Owen. Despite their differences of opinion on religion, they were all against slavery, and that's what brought them together. After traveling all the way across Iowa, Brown and his group stayed through the winter in the community of Springdale. The men drilled and read Forbes' book, Duties of a Soldier. They also held mock trials and set up a fake legislature, creating a fake state on paper called the state of Topeka. In it, they passed a law forbidding slavery and giving men and women, black and white, the right to vote, a revolutionary concept in America in the 1850s. They created a state seal that featured a black man with a drawn sword standing on a cannon with the inscription, Justice to All Mankind. In mid-January 1858, Brown traveled east to Ohio, leaving the rest to spend the winter in Iowa. He found that Forbes had went east and turned on him, traveling around the Northeast defaming Brown's name to abolitionist circles. Forbes described Brown as reckless and unreliable, and had taken advantage of humanitarian efforts to help himself. The slurs were for naught. Those who he spoke to, including William Seward and Horace Greeley, did not believe the Englishman. Brown had spent very little time with his wife and children in North Elba for the last 3 years, but going home was risky. He was homesick, but he feared being arrested, so he stayed in Rochester, New York for 3 weeks in February with his friend Frederick Douglass. While there, he reached out to his biggest backers and described his reasoning as such. Railroad business on a somewhat extended scale is the identical object for which I am trying to get means. I have been connected with that business as commonly conducted from my boyhood and never let an opportunity slip. I have been operating to some purpose the past season, but I now have a measure on foot that I feel for sure would awaken in you something more than a common interest if you could understand it. He needed funds and support for his invasion of the South and for creating a free slave community in the Appalachian Mountains. With the creation of such a community, it needed bylaws to live by. Brown put together a constitution called the Provisional Constitution and Ordinances for the People of the United States. The opening of the document stated, Whereas slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than the most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetual imprisonment and hopeless servitude or absolute extermination. In utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self-evident truths set forth in our Declaration of Independence. Therefore, we, the citizens of the United States and the oppressed people, who by a recent decision of the Supreme Court are declared to have no rights which the white man is bound to respect, together with all the people degraded by the laws thereof, do for the time being ordain and establish ourselves the fallen provisional constitution and ordinances, the better to protect our persons, property, lives, and liberties, and to govern our actions. In his Constitution, Brown gave citizenship to all marginalized and oppressed groups, which stood in stark comparison to the recent Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney stated that African Americans could not be citizens because of the color of their skin. Functionally, Brown's proposed government didn't look different than the United States government at the time. He included the same three branches of government, but with one big difference. Men, women, black or white, could hold any of those offices. It would not be limited to white men. He also stated in the Constitution that this document was not to overthrow the current Constitution, but to reform it into what it should have been. However, the rules for the citizens were strict. Profane swearing, filthy conversation, indecent behavior, or indecent exposure of the person, or intoxication, or quarreling shall not be allowed or tolerated. Also, all people known to be of good character and of sound mind and suitable age, whether male or female, were encouraged to carry arms openly. Regular religious and education instruction were to be adhered to as well. At a February meeting with two of his Secret Six members, Brown laid out his Constitution and his plan for an invasion of Northern Virginia. Gerrit Smith and Frank Sanborn listened intently to Brown's proposal and brought up objections and obstacles that Brown might encounter. He countered their objections and continued the discussion of his plan of using the mountains of Western Virginia to house a group of freedom fighters and eventually free every slave in the South. The two supporters had their doubts about his success and whether he would make it out of such an attempt alive. Brown countered with a biblical reference: "I expect to effect a mighty conquest, even though it be like the last victory of Samson." Brown met with other like-minded abolitionists like Dr. Alexander Milton Ross, who was known for going into the slave states and arming slaves and helping them onto the Underground Railroad. In Mississippi, he had been nearly lynched for his actions. Ross and Brown had several hours of long conversations. To conceal his identity, Brown now wore a long beard and called himself Nelson Hawkins. He knew that his actions in Kansas could result in harm or confinement coming to himself, so to continue his fight against slavery, he had to become as unrecognizable as possible. Next, Brown went to Canada, where he was attempting to organize an anti-slavery meeting. There, he met with Harriet Tubman, a woman born into slavery in Maryland, freed herself, then returned to free others held in bondage. Brown respectively referred to her as the General. Another prominent African American Brown met while in Canada was Martin Delany. Delany was known to discourage blacks from working with white anti-slavery advocates because of the racism held against African Americans even in those circles. Delany advocated for the removal of blacks from the United States to Africa, the Caribbean, and South America to create a society free of whites who could oppress them. However, as one of Brown's biographers explains, John Brown had much to do with Delany's change from an angry black separatist to a warrior for an integrated union. Delany found in Brown something he had never seen in a white: the desire to organize an anti-slavery movement co-supervised by blacks and whites and committed to the violent overthrow of slavery. If America could produce a man like Brown, Delany decided it was a nation worth fighting for. After a brief travel to Iowa to pick up his men training for the raid, he continued to Canada, specifically the town of Chatham, where a large black community lived. There, he held a 2-day convention, with the majority of attendees being black. He hoped to form a small army with which he would use to invade the South. He also delivered the Provisional Constitution, and they held elections for this government. Both the presidency and the vice presidency was held by black men. One of Brown's biographers explained the choosing of officials. Taken symbolically, however, the government had a great significance. In the imaginary, capsule-sized America Brown fashioned, African Americans occupied the presidency, the vice presidency, and many other offices. In the mountain colony he helped to create, the racial barriers that imprisoned American blacks would fall. Political and economic avenues would be open to everyone, regardless of race and gender. Brown would only gain one recruit from this convention that would join him at Harper's Ferry, mostly because his plan to invade Virginia got derailed when word came to him that Hugh Forbes had been telling prominent Republican politicians about the plan. This caused many anti-slavery supporters for the war in Kansas to question Brown's intentions. Many of them had supplied money to Brown because he had promised to fight slavery in Kansas, not Virginia. To quell their accusations that he was misappropriating funds and weapons, Brown dispersed his group of warriors and headed for Kansas, but with his mind on Virginia. As Brown traveled back to Kansas, he stopped in Wayne, Ohio, and established a group called the Black Strings because of the black ribbons worn by its members to identify one another. The group would be dedicated to help support the Underground Railroad. Each member was made to sign an agreement that they believed all races should be equal. When Brown got back to Kansas, he found that a massacre of Free Staters had just occurred, but the governor of the proposed state gave amnesty to both sides, hoping that that would quell the violence. Brown, in retaliation for the massacre, built a stone and wood building near the site where the Trading Post massacre took place, and even helped nurse back to health some of those men wounded in the massacre. He called the building Fort Snyder. At that location, he formed what was called Shubal Morgan's Company, a military unit of about 15 men who signed an agreement against profane language and general indecent behavior. The name came from Brown's alias he was using to escape the authorities. As he and some of his group rode near the Reverend Martin White's home, the man who had killed Brown's son Frederick 2 years before, a member of the group asked Brown would he like to go talk with him, insinuating that they could kill White. Brown rejected the offer. He would state, "People mistake my objects. I would not hurt one hair of his head. I would not go 1 inch to take his life. I do not harbor the feelings of revenge. I act from principle. My aim and object is to restore human rights." In September 1858, a prominent Free Stater was indicted for destroying a ballot box. The Free Stater invaded the town of Paris, Kansas, to destroy the indictment, but couldn't find the papers. Brown was on the outskirts of the town but did not participate in the raid. Nevertheless, pro-slavery authorities used his close proximity to the raid to put a $500 bounty on Brown's head. By December, Brown had avoided capture. The appearance of an anti-slavery man with word that a Missouri slave was about to be sold to a man in Texas got his attention. On the night of December 20th, Brown led his band of men into Missouri. They freed the slave named Jim Daniels and his family, taking anything predominantly used by the enslaved and anything that the slaves had made. Some of Brown's party ignored Brown's orders and took the slave owner's possessions. Brown then came to another slave owner's home and took his slaves. In all, Brown's party liberated 11 Missouri slaves and brought them into Kansas, but the final destination would be Canada. The Missouri governor would put a $3,000 bounty on Brown's head, and President James Buchanan would add $250 to that sum. Brown's raid into Missouri stoked fears in the hearts of the slave owners of that state. Some sold their slaves, fearing that Brown would invade again and steal them. At least by selling them, they would gain some money. Brown's raid into Missouri calmed a lot of tensions, though. Missourians feared reprisals from Brown, so they opted for less violence, and Kansas was already heading towards becoming a free state, which sent a lot of slave owners out of the proposed state. Brown's liberating raid convinced them to leave. In a discussion with a fellow Free Stater before leaving for Canada with the 11 former slaves, Brown talked about the history of slavery since the colonial days and insisted that the founding fathers, even the ones who were slaveholders, believed that slavery should one day be abolished. The two men differed on if the slavery issue would result in a war. Brown stated, "No, the war is not over. It is a treacherous lull before the storm. We are on the eve of one of the greatest wars in history. For my part, I drew my sword in Kansas when they attacked us, and I will never sheath it until this war is over." While traveling through Kansas, Federal soldiers began harassing Brown and his men. At one point, they waited in formation across a creek for the party to pass. Brown ordered his 20 men, outnumbered 4-1, to dash across the creek and charge them, believing that the Federal soldiers would run, and indeed they did. The Battle of the Spurs was an amazing victory for Brown. During the battle, he took a few prisoners and had them walk while the rest of the party rode on horses or in wagons, but to console them, Brown walked with them and lectured them on the evils of slavery. The prisoners were soon released, and he continued his journey through Nebraska and into Iowa, where Brown thought the Quakers would support his actions. But the violence he had used convinced them to denounce his actions. In Iowa City, a pro-slavery man began speaking in the middle of town, saying, "If I could get sight of John Brown, I would shoot him on the spot. I would never let him get a chance to steal any more slaves." Hearing this, Brown walked up to the man and said, "My friend, you talk very brave, and as you will never have a better opportunity to shoot old Brown than right here and now, you can have a chance." Brown handed him 2 pistols and invited him to shoot. The pro-slavery speaker handed back the pistols and walked off. The group would then be placed in a boxcar and sent by rail to Chicago, where the detective Alan Pinkerton hid them and got them on a train to Detroit. There, Brown put the now 12 former slaves on a ferry to Canada. Along the incredible journey, Daniels's pregnant wife had given birth to a son, whom Daniels would name John Brown Daniels. Tears rolled down Brown's face as he said goodbye to them, having transported them over 1,000 miles to freedom. From there, Brown went to Cleveland, an area in a heated debate and upheaval because of the arrest of the Oberlin rescuers. A group of blacks and whites rescued a black man who had been subdued by slave hunters in nearby Oberlin. The rescuers had been charged with violating the fugitive slave law. Brown would give a speech to that town against the fugitive slave law, and then he would travel to New York and then to Concord, Massachusetts, where he delivered a speech to a crowd including Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Despite their anti-slavery stances, the people of New England weren't putting forth the money for Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He kept traveling, trying to garner funds for his planned slave insurrection. He also made a payment for the pikes he had ordered previously. They would be finished and shipped to a secret weapons cache in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Next, Brown would travel to North Elba for what would be the last time. He hoped to recruit his sons for the Virginia Plan. Many of them had sworn off violence ever since Pottawatomie Creek, but Brown was able to convince John Jr., Owen, Oliver, and Watson to join him. However, John Jr. was still not mentally fit for such an attack, since his bout with what people at the time referred to as insanity in 1856. So, Brown sent him on a tour of the North to gather funds, but because of his mental state, John Jr. would gain little from that tour. John Brown would travel throughout the North between Ohio and Pennsylvania, readying his troops and checking on his supplies, and by July 1859, he was in Harper's Ferry. One of Brown's biographers described the location. Harper's Ferry was a town of some 2,500, situated at the confluence of the Shenandoah River, which ran deep into Virginia, and the Potomac River, which stretched southeast to and beyond Washington, some 60 miles away. Baltimore was 70 miles to the east by rail, and Richmond nearly 170 miles south. Ruggedly beautiful, Harper's Ferry occupied a small peninsula framed by towering cliffs. To the east stood Maryland Heights, more than 1,200 feet tall, and to the west the equally precipitous Loudon Heights. The business center of Harper's Ferry was a low area built around Shenandoah and Potomac streets. Despite its forbidden terrain, Harper's Ferry was centrally located and historically significant. A hub of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, it was connected to mainland on both sides by long bridges that permitted trains to carry cargo and passengers between the East Coast and Ohio, where rail links opened into the Western Territories. It was George Washington's choice as the site of the United States Armory, which opened in 1796. By the time John Brown arrived there, it had established itself as the largest weapons maker in the South. Hall's Rifle Works, on a small island in the Shenandoah, made over 10,000 stand-of-arms annually, and nearly 20 times that number were stored in the fenced and gated arsenal on Potomac Street. When Brown got to Harper's Ferry, he met with John Cook, who had been living there for a year, scouting the area, while being a schoolteacher and a canal worker. He had even fallen in love with a local woman and gotten married, with a child on the way. Brown then made arrangements to rent a farm known as the Kennedy Farm just across the border in Maryland, where he would prepare for the attack on Harper's Ferry. Oliver, Owen, and another man named Jerry Anderson was with him initially. The farm needed more attendants, so Brown's daughter Anne and Oliver's wife Martha came to help with the housekeeping. Over the next month, his recruits came to the farm, both black and white men, dedicated to the end of slavery and believers in John Brown's principles and objectives to rid the United States of the institution. Brown, under the name Isaac Smith, and Oliver, as well as Cook, explored the region, gathering valuable intelligence about the people and the terrain. Anne would sit for hours on the porch, sewing or reading to keep an eye out for anyone approaching the house. If someone did come by to visit, she would rush the recruits upstairs and only then let the visitor inside, not wanting to raise any suspicion. However, a Miss Huffmaster nearby would make regular visits, and on at least one occasion barged into the house and saw blacks and whites mingling about, but she never went to the authorities. In mid August, Frederick Douglass would come south and meet Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania at a quarry. Brown pleaded for Douglass to join in the raid, as he said, "Come with me, Douglass. I will defend you with my life. I want you for a special purpose. When I strike, the bees will begin to swarm, and I shall want you to help hive them." Douglass refused to join, but he was accompanied by a fugitive slave who had been living with the Douglass family named Shields Green. Green opted to stay with Brown and join the fight. That summer, Brown wrote a new Declaration of Independence, one insisting on the freedom of all people and arguing that all people, black and white, man and woman, had a right to full citizenship under the law. He also wrote a statement entitled Vindication of the Invasion, which was to explain why he launched the raid on Harper's Ferry in the event of his death. He explained that the invasion was in accordance with his settled policy and that it was a discriminating blow at slavery, and he affirmed that it was over and above all others right. Brown's plan was getting out into the world. His own recruits were sending letters home describing their plan to invade Virginia, and Cook was spreading rumors about a slave uprising in Harper's Ferry. More surprisingly, a group of Quakers from Iowa that knew Brown wrote to Secretary of War John B. Floyd that John Brown was planning an invasion of Virginia. They would say that they informed Floyd because they feared what would happen to Brown if he attempted the invasion. Floyd didn't think anything of the message and cast it aside. Meanwhile, Brown received nearly 200 Sharps rifles and 950 pikes in September in preparation for the attack. On September 29th, Brown sent Anne and Martha back to North Elba with the time of the attack approaching. By mid-October, Brown had gained one more recruit, bringing his number up to 21 liberators, 5 of them being black. 3 men, including Owen Brown, would remain at the farmhouse to guard the weapons and bring them to a schoolhouse near the town for distribution after the raid. The rest of the group were assigned their posts. They would cut telegraph wires to prevent information from spreading quickly, take prisoners to use as hostages, capture the rifle factory, and liberate slaves in the surrounding countryside. In dramatic fashion, Brown wanted his men to capture Colonel Lewis Washington, the great-grandson of George Washington. They would then force him to hand over the sword presented to his great-grandfather by Frederick the Great to one of Brown's black recruits named Osborne Anderson. All of this was to begin on Sunday, October 16th. That morning, the men held a Bible service and prayed for the Lord's help in freeing the slaves of the South. At 8 p.m., the men started on their journey to Harper's Ferry and immortality. The group of men led by John Brown traveled along the winding roads from the Kennedy farm towards Harper's Ferry. They crossed the bridge that spanned the Potomac River. There they encountered a watchman named William Williams. The old man was surprised to be taken prisoner, but obeyed his captors by walking across the bridge. Watson Brown and Stuart Taylor of Brown's party kept watch at the bridge while the rest proceeded to the Armory building. There they took another prisoner, a watchman named Daniel Whalen. John Brown announced that, "I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the slaves in this state. I have possession of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood." Once at the armory, the group spread out, with some going to watch the Shenandoah Bridge, while others proceeded to Hall's Rifle Works, overpowering the guard as well as taking a few people prisoner who were in the streets. Within 2 hours of them leaving the Kennedy farm, Brown had control of the armory, the rifle works, and prisoners. Now it was time to liberate slaves in the countryside and swell their ranks. He sent 6 men, 3 white and 3 black, to free as many enslaved as they could, intentionally sending a racially diverse group to do the liberation. The 6 men traveled 5 miles away to the home of Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington. At about midnight, they captured Washington. He tried to tempt his captors with whiskey, but they were unwavering in their mission. The group forced Washington to hand Osborne Anderson, a black man, a pistol from Lafayette and the sword given to Washington by Frederick the Great. The group loaded Washington and his slaves into his own carriage and a farm wagon and rumbled toward Harper's Ferry, leaving Washington's family crying and worrying about his safety. The 6 men then went to the farm of John Alsted, took John and his son hostage, and freed their 6 slaves, putting all 8 people into a wagon and brought them to the armory. Brown gave the newly freed slaves weapons to guard the white hostages and to defend themselves with. Some enthusiastically took up the weapons, particularly Washington's coachman named Jim. Others were fearful of what was happening. Some of them thought that they were being kidnapped to be sold to the Deep South, while others were afraid of what would happen if they were caught. Brown envisioned slaves swarming to Harper's Ferry to join the insurrection, but they weren't coming as he thought, so he stalled, staying in the town. He held out, thinking that more enslaved would come to his ranks. When the watchman that was to relieve William Williams approached the bridge, Brown's men captured him, but the watchman got away, even though a shot fired at him grazed his skull. The watchman entered the Galt House, a saloon, and told the men about the insurrection, but they thought he was drunk. However, when the barkeeper went outside to investigate, Brown's men took him prisoner. The escaped watchman left the saloon and made his way to the bridge again, this time to warn the 125 train from Wheeling, West Virginia, that there was danger. The train stopped and some men got out to investigate. A free black baggage handler named Shepard Hayward got off the train to find William Williams, but came face to face with Oliver Brown and Stuart Taylor. The 2 men aimed their weapons at him and told him to halt. Hayward started for the railway office when the 2 men shot. One bullet went into his back just below the heart. He would die around noon the next day. The first person killed in John Brown's raid to liberate the enslaved population of the South was a free black man. During the early morning, 2 brothers were captured and their slaves freed. Those slaves, along with Cook from Brown's party, took weapons from the Kennedy farm to a schoolhouse where the group was to rendezvous after the raid. Brown allowed the conductor of the train from Wheeling to continue his route, which negated him cutting the telegraph lines earlier. The conductor of the train stopped at Monocacy and wired the master of transportation of Baltimore and informed him that the abolitionists had taken over Harper's Ferry with the intention of freeing slaves. The president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad telegraphed the president and the governor of Virginia, informing them of the situation, which began the movement of troops to Harper's Ferry. The doctor who tended to Shepard Hayward began to alert the townspeople of the situation and even traveled 8 miles away to Charlestown to get the local militia there to help Harper's Ferry. As the morning dawned, the armory workers began coming to work. Brown's men took them hostage. In all, about 35 people were taken hostage by Brown. Townspeople and militias began to converge on the town, pushing away Brown's men at key locations, like the 2 bridges that would allow Brown to escape. A firefight ensued as Brown's men began skirmishing with the townspeople and militias. The first of Brown's party to die was Dangerfield Newby, a black man who joined Brown to free his wife and children who lived in bondage 30 miles south of Harper's Ferry. In his pocket was a letter from his wife saying, "Oh dear Dangerfield, come this fall, without fail, money or no money. I want to see you so much that this is the one bright hope I have before me." In retaliation, the citizens desecrated Newby's corpse by cutting off his ears and genitals and putting sticks into the bullet wound. The body was dumped into a gutter for hogs to eat. A journalist described in gory detail how the hogs rummaged through the man's body and feasted on his flesh. More of Brown's group died as they abandoned the rifle works. 2 were gunned down in the Shenandoah River, while another was stranded on a rock in the same river and taken prisoner when a brave soul ventured midstream to retrieve the abolitionist. Brown knew that he had only a few options: to negotiate surrender or fight to the death. Escape was no longer an option. He had waited too late. Leaving the armory to be guarded by 2 men, he and what was left of the raiding party and 11 hostages made their way to the fire engine house. From there, Brown attempted to negotiate an escape. He sent Aaron Stevens and Watson Brown with a hostage, the armory clerk, Mr. Kitzmiller, under the flag of truce to the townspeople. The armed mob outside the engine house shot Stevens and Watson. As Stevens lay wounded on the ground, one of the hostages ran out, dragged Stevens to the train station for medical help, then went back to the engine house to resume his status as a hostage. William Lehman, who had been with Brown in Kansas, thought it best to escape across the Potomac River to Maryland, where he could inform Cook and those at the schoolhouse what happened. Brown agreed and Lehman ran out of the engine house, but was shot while crossing the river. He crawled to a rock midstream, and one of the citizens swam out to him, holding his pistol above the water. When the citizen got to Lehman, Lehman said, "Don't shoot, I surrender." The man just smiled, leveled the pistol, and shot Lehman in the head. His body sprawled on the rock. For days, men used the body as target practice until it floated downriver. John Cook, who was helping transport weapons, went to one of the locks along the waterway to see what was happening. He had been hearing rumors from the civilians outside of the town. He climbed a tree so he could see in the town. To divert the mob's attention from Brown, Cook fired a shot, but that only got the attention of the crowd, who shot at him in the tree. One bullet hit the branch he was sitting on, sending him tumbling 15 feet. Bruised, he returned to the farmhouse. Brown and his men, only 4 of whom remained unhurt, were trapped in the engine house. At 11 p.m. on October 17th, Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived with 90 Marines and accompanied by Lieutenant Jeb Stuart. Lee initially thought he would launch a midnight assault, but he feared that would endanger the hostages, so he constructed a plan for a dawn attack. Meanwhile, Brown paced back and forth in the darkness. He was prepared to die, but some of his men were having second thoughts. One of the hostages said that Brown was committing treason. Dauphin Thompson and Jeremiah Anderson asked Brown if what they were doing could be considered treason. Brown said certainly. In that case, they both announced that they would not fire another shot. When dawn broke, Jeb Stuart went up to the engine house. Brown opened the door about 4 inches with a cocked carbine in hand. When Stuart saw Brown, he was amazed to see his old nemesis from Kansas. Up to that point, Brown was simply known as Smith or Captain Smith, so Stuart was astonished to see old Osawatomie Brown. Stuart gave Brown Colonel Lee's demand of surrender. Brown refused and wanted to be allowed to escape. With no other choice, Stuart followed Lee's orders. Brown had refused surrender, so Stuart waved his hat above his head, signaling to the Marines to start battering down the door. A dozen Marines began pounding the door with sledgehammers, but they weren't making much headway. Inside the engine house, Lewis Washington said Brown was the coolest and firmest man I ever saw in defying danger and death. With one son dead by his side and another shot through, he felt the pulse of his dying son with one hand and held his rifle with the other, and commanded his men with the utmost composure, encouraging them to be firm and to sell their lives as dearly as they could. The Marines then grabbed a ladder and used it as a battering ram to open a hole in the door. Lieutenant Israel Green was the first one in, and Washington identified Brown. Green thrusted his sword toward Brown, but the sword bounced off something and didn't go deep. He then began to slash Brown over the head, inflicting many wounds. Other members of Brown's party were skewered by bayonets. Edwin Coppock and Shields Green were taken into custody. Brown was carried to the paymaster's office and laid next to his wounded friend Aaron Stevens. Reporters and officials asked Brown questions. One asked, "Did you expect to get assistance here from whites as well as from blacks?" "I did," Brown answered. The man then said, "Then you have been disappointed in not getting it from either." Brown said, "Yes, I have been disappointed." One of the prominent men who came to see Brown was Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham. He asked Brown who sent him. Brown stated, "No man sent me here. It was my own prompting, that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you are pleased to ascribe it to. I acknowledge no master in human form." James Mason, one of Virginia's senators, asked, "What was your objective in coming?" Brown said, "We came to free the slaves, and only that." Mason then asked, "How do you justify your acts?" Brown said, "I think, my friend, you are guilty of a great wrong to God and against humanity. I say it without wishing to be offensive, and I believe it would be perfectly right to interfere with you so far as to free those you wickedly and willfully hold in bondage. I think I did right, and that others will do right who interfere with you at any time and at all times." He was asked, "Do you consider this a religious movement?" Brown happily stated, "The greatest service man can render to God." "Do you consider yourself an instrument in the hands of Providence?" Brown responded, "I do." Brown would go on to state, "I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of black people oppressed by the slave system, just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. This is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. I wish to say furthermore that you had better, all of you people of the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now, but this question is still to be settled." The governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, said of Brown, "They are themselves mistaken who take him to be a madman. He is a bundle of the best nerves I ever saw cut and thrust and bleeding and in bonds. He is a man of clear head, of courage, fortitude, and simple ingenuousness. He is cool, collected, and indomitable, and it is but just to him to say that he was humane to his prisoners, as attested to me by Colonel Washington and Mr. Mills, and he inspired me with great trust in his integrity as a man of truth. He is a fanatic, vain, garrulous, but firm, truthful, and intelligent. His men, too, who survive, except the free blacks with him, are like him. Brown's great raid had finally come to an end, and now he was to answer for his actions. He was taken to the Charlestown jail to await his trial. Although John Brown was in custody, the soldiers who captured him had more work to do. The Maryland schoolhouse where a rendezvous was supposed to occur was investigated by a militia company. They found 21 boxes of weapons and supplies, including Sharp's rifles, revolvers, pikes, cutlasses, picks, shovels, tents, clothing, stationery, and medical kits. Lieutenant Jeb Stuart led some of the Marines to the Kennedy farm, finding Brown's provisional constitution, letters from Northern supporters, copies of Hugh Forbes' manual, and maps of the Southern states. Some of the pikes found at the farm were given away as souvenirs. 5 men were in custody at Harper's Ferry: Brown, Aaron Stevenson with multiple gunshot wounds, Edwin Coppock, John Copeland, and Shields Green. The latter 3 were not wounded. The men were arraigned on 3 charges: treason against the state of Virginia, inciting slaves to rebellion, and murder. Governor Henry Wise wanted Brown to be tried in Virginia to teach the North a lesson. Wise was also vindictive about the raid. It had happened on Virginia soil, and Brown's small party held off nearly 800 militia and other troops before finally being captured. A newspaper reported, when the governor was informed of the mere handful of men who had created all this bobbery, he boiled over. A militia leader would be charged with cowardice by Wise's son in court. Wise, on the evening of Brown's capture, would read some of Brown's papers aloud in Harper's Ferry to illustrate his suspicions that Brown was a representative of the anti-slavery North. In fact, the North turned their back on Brown. Not that the North had been altogether supportive of him in the first place. William Lloyd Garrison's paper denounced the raid on Harper's Ferry, and other anti-slavery Northerners condemned Brown's actions. The lack of support became even more disturbing to the Secret Six, who funded Brown, when the letters to Brown from the Secret Six were published in newspapers. They were outed as Brown's backers. Gerrit Smith became so disturbed about being associated with Brown that he had a mental breakdown, leading to him being put in the New York State Asylum for the Insane in Utica. He became so consumed with guilt that he contemplated going down to the Charlestown jail and joining Brown. 4 of the Secret Six left the country to avoid possible capture. Frederick Douglass got tipped off that Virginia agents were coming to interrogate him, so he fled to Canada, then England. Other than Smith, the only other backer to stay in the country was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was also one of the 2 who stood by John Brown in his actions, calling it the most formidable insurrection that has ever occurred. The other who stood by John Brown but fled the country was Theodore Parker. Parker wrote on his deathbed in Italy that, "Of course I was not astonished to hear that an attempt had been made to free the slaves in a certain part of Virginia, nor should I be astonished if another insurrection or rebellion took place in the state of blank, or third in blank, or fourth in blank. Such things are to be expected, for they do not depend merely on the private will of a man like Captain Brown and his associates, but on the general causes which move all humankind to hate wrong and love right. Such insurrections will continue as long as slavery lasts." When John Brown was asked how he pled to the charges brought against him, Brown rose and stated, "I did not ask for any quarter at the time I was taken. I did not ask to have my life spared. The governor of the state of Virginia tendered me his assurance that I should have a fair trial. If you seek my blood, you can have it at any moment, without this mockery of a trial. I have had no counsel. I have not been able to advise with anyone. If we are forced with a mere form a trial for execution, you might spare yourselves that trouble. I am ready for my fate. I do not ask for a trial. I beg no mockery of a trial, no insult, nothing but that which conscience gives, or cowardice would drive you to practice. I ask again to be excused from this mockery of a trial. I do not even know what the special design of this examination is. I do not know what is to be the benefit of it to the Commonwealth. I have now little further to ask, other than that I may not be foolishly insulted, only as cowardly barbarians insult those who fall into their power." 2 lawyers were assigned to Brown, and he was asked whether he accepted them. Brown stated, I wish for counsel if I am to have a trial, but if I am to have nothing but a mockery of a trial, as I've said, I do not care anything about counsel. It is unnecessary to trouble any gentleman with that duty. The trial began on Wednesday, October 26th. All 5 men, Brown, Stevens, Coppock, Copeland, and Green, were escorted by armed guards to the courthouse, where the badly wounded Stevens and Brown would lay on a mattress and a cot in the courtroom. It was decided that Brown would be tried alone, so the rest would be taken back to the jail. Brown pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. Brown would lay on a cot during the trial, but stand when addressing the court. One of Brown's biographers described the atmosphere of the courtroom. From start to close, the courtroom was crowded with 500 to 600 spectators who ceaselessly opened peanuts and chestnuts, throwing the shells onto the courtroom floor. The accumulating shells crunched whenever anyone walked or moved their feet while seated. The spectators puffed cigars and spat tobacco juice on the floor. The air was thick with stale smoke. Periodically, the bailiff shouted that no smoking was permitted, but this resulted in only a momentary cessation, followed by a mass resumption of cigar puffing, interspersed with curses hissed at John Brown. The first prosecutor for the state of Virginia was Charles B. Harding, but he came to court drunk and would also fall asleep during parts of the trial. He would be replaced with Andrew Hunter. Brown's lawyers first attempted to prove that he was insane. This idea came from a group of Ohio abolitionists who sought to soften Brown's sentence. They pointed out that members of Brown's mother's family had been placed in asylums for the insane. Brown admitted that they had, but declared that he was not insane. With insanity off the table, Brown's lawyer attempted to dismiss the trial on jurisdictional grounds. He argued that the charge of treason against the state of Virginia made no sense because there had been no assault on the state's government and no attempt to establish a rival one. Plus, the crime was committed on federal property. The murder charge would apply here as well. It was done on federal property, not the state's. Andrew Hunter argued that Virginia had long assumed jurisdiction over crimes committed at Harper's Ferry, and this one should be no different. Around midnight on October 27th, a young Boston lawyer named George Henry Hoyt came to join Brown's defense team, but was actually a spy on behalf of a group of Northern abolitionists. He was to act as a conduit for Brown and Northerners, as well as assess possibilities for a rescue attempt. Hoyt was led on to Brown's counsel. However, on October 28th, during the testimony of Henry Hunter, who killed one of Brown's compatriots, William Thompson, and helped fling the body into the river, Brown lost his composure and declared the trial unfair and that his counsel wasn't handling his case appropriately. His two lawyers withdrew from the council, leaving Hoyt as Brown's lawyer. Hoyt was just 21 years old, and now he was the lead lawyer in one of the biggest cases in American history. The startled young man didn't stay startled for long. He found that two lawyers, Samuel Chilton and Hiram Griswold, were on their way to Charlestown to be the defense counsel for Brown. The next morning, the two men showed up. They brought in Brown's hostages as witnesses. They testified that Brown treated them with kindness and that he revealed to them that his raid was one of liberation, not one of murder. When Brown's lawyer asked that Brown be permitted to defend himself against one charge at a time, since it was impossible to deal with treason, murder, and insurrection at once, the judge denied the request. In the closing arguments, Griswold represented the defense, stating that since Brown had no connection with Virginia, then he couldn't be charged with treason to that state. The raid failed, he argued, so how could he have sparked a slave revolt if it hadn't materialized? The final argument was that the battle that ensued couldn't be considered murder. Andrew Hunter, in his closing argument, stated that treason against one state was treason against all states. Brown had stolen slaves and given them weapons, and if the raid had succeeded, Virginia would have looked a lot like Haiti during its revolution. As far as murder goes, he acquiesced that some of the deaths couldn't be called murder, but many of them were deliberate killings. The jury deliberated for only 45 minutes, and the verdict was guilty on all three charges. On Wednesday, November 2nd, John Brown stood before the court to receive his sentencing. Judge Parker asked if Brown wanted to state any reason why he shouldn't be sentenced. Brown fixed his eyes on Parker, leaned forward on his lawyer's table, and said, "I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter, as I did last winter, when I went into Missouri and took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally left them in Canada. I designed to do the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder or treason or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I interfered in the manner in which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the great portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. The court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that man should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavored to act up to that instruction. I say I am too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. Let me say one word further. I feel entirely satisfied with the treatment I have received on my trial. Considering all the circumstances, it has been more generous than I expected. I feel no consciousness of my guilt. I have stated that from the first what was my intention and what was not. I never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of any kind. Let me say also a word in regard to the statements made by some to those connected with me. I hear it has been said by some of them that I have induced them to join me, but the contrary is true. I do not say this to injure them, but as regretting their weakness. There is not one of them but joined me of his own accord, and the greater part of them at their own expense. A number of them I never saw and never had a word of conversation with till the day they came to me, and that was for the purpose I have stated. Within Brown's speech he had lied. A gun had indeed been fired and a man killed in the Missouri slave liberation. Also, Brown fully intended to launch a slave insurrection. As he said on many occasions, he wouldn't strike out with the purpose of killing, but if someone tried to stop the slaves from joining him in the mountains, then he would have no choice. Still, the speech had a great impact. It was published far and wide, gaining great attention throughout the North. After Brown spoke, Judge Parker passed sentence. John Brown was sentenced to death by hanging on December 2nd. John Brown sat in the Charlestown jail, unmoved by his surroundings. A steady stream of visitors came to visit him. He even talked cordially with slaveholders. The only people he turned away were Southern clergymen. Slaveholding Christianity disgusted him. He looked forward to his hanging. He wrote to his half-brother Jeremiah, "I am gaining in health slowly, and am quite cheerful in view of my approaching end, being fully persuaded that I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose. I feel 1,000 times more on account of my sorrowing friends than on my own account. So far as I am concerned, I count it all joy. I have fought the good fight, and have, as I trust, finished my course." Brown's raid, even in failure, terrified slave owners. A newspaper reported that in Charlestown, a feeling of irrepressible uneasiness still lingers here. The streets by day are filled with groups of people discussing, with profound seriousness, the chances of renewed attacks, escapes, and insurrections. Under the walls of the courthouse, the debates often rise to a warmth at once betraying the alarm which will all attempt to conceal. At night, the thoroughfares are guarded by armed patrols who arrest without distinction all persons who wander from their homes, unless immediate proof can be given of the innocence of their intentions. All strangers are regarded with particular suspicion. Brown didn't want to be rescued or escape. He wrote to his friends that there should be no attempt to get him out of the Charlestown jail. For one, he happily would die for the cause which he fought for, and two, he made a friendship with John Avis, the jailer. Brown knew that if the jail was stormed, then Avis would be hurt or killed in defending the jail. Even more ironic is that Avis had fought against Brown during the raid, but treated his captor with respect and dignity. Avis allowed Brown to have visitors with no witnesses. Avis showed Brown kindness, and Brown wouldn't forget it. Letters came to Governor Wise to change Brown's sentence to life imprisonment. Anti-slavery supporters did it out of sympathy for Brown, and because they were supportive of his cause. Pro-slavery supporters asked for life imprisonment because they didn't want the anti-slavery side to have any martyrs. They also viewed Brown and his supporters as a hydra. When one gets cut down, more would rise. Nevertheless, many slave owners wanted Brown hung for his actions, whether he would end up a martyr or not. Brown's statements in the courtroom and from inside the jail cell reached every corner of the country. One abolitionist wrote, "John Brown, the friend of the slave, had edited every paper, presided over every domestic and social circle, over every prayer, conference, and church meeting, over every pulpit and platform, and over every legislature, judicial, and executive department of the government, and he will edit every paper and govern Virginia and all the states, and preside over Congress, guide its deliberations, and control all political caucuses and elections for 1 year to come." Brown believed that his execution would do more for the anti-slavery cause than all the work he had done up until that point. Still, in his letters, those deeds he believed to be good didn't keep him from his sinfulness. His Calvinistic beliefs still coursed through his veins. "I feel astonished that one so exceedingly vile and unworthy as I am would even be suffered to have a place among those who, when they came to die, as all must, were permitted to pay that debt of nature in defense of the right and of God's eternal and immutable truth. My only anxiety is to be properly assured of my fitness for the company of those who are washed from all filthiness, and for the presence of Him who is infinitely pure." Mahala Dole, who lost her husband and two of her sons at Pottawatomie Creek to Brown and his followers, wrote to Brown from her Tennessee home, "I do feel gratified to hear that you were stopped in your fiendish career at Harper's Ferry. With the loss of your two sons, you can now appreciate my distress in Kansas. When you entered my house at midnight and arrested my husband and two boys, and took them out of the yard, and in cold blood shot them dead in my hearing, you can't say you done it to free slaves. We had none and never expected to own one, but has only made me a poor widow with helpless children. Oh, how it pained my heart to hear the dying groans of my husband and children." Brown apparently didn't respond to her letter. In a postscript, Miss Dole wrote that her son John was now grown and wanted to be in Charlestown on December 2nd to adjust the rope around Brown's neck. In an interview with a reporter, Brown addressed Pottawatomie Creek. He said, "Time and the honest verdict of posterity will prove of every act of mine to prevent slavery from being established in Kansas. I never shed the blood of fellow man, except in self-defense or in promotion of a righteous cause." George Stearns, one of the Secret Six, hired a sculptor and sent him to Charlestown, where he entered the cell and did a sketch of Brown to be used when he created a bust of the Abolitionist that would be on display in the Stearns household. On December 1st, Brown's wife Mary came to visit him. John Avis's wife checked Mary for any weapons. Then she was led into Brown's cell. The two hugged one another for a while without speaking. Then Brown calmed her fears by telling her that he believed this was all for the best. Their meeting lasted for 4 hours. During it, he verbally gave her his will. He also told her that to save money, he and the others to be executed could be burned and what was left taken to North Elba. Mary recoiled at that, and through the permission of Governor Wise, the bodies would be transported north. On the morning of December 2nd, the date of Brown's execution, Brown sent a message to the state's prosecutor, Andrew Hunter, asking to see him. Hunter stopped what he was doing and went down to the jail. When he arrived, Brown asked him to put his will in order and make it official. Hunter asked for it to be done in Brown's own hand, but Brown said that he was far too busy answering letters and that he would dictate it to Hunter. Hunter agreed, and for the next hour and a half, The two put Brown's will together. In addition to the will stated to Mary, Brown wanted the sheriff, James W. Campbell, and his jailer, John Avis, to have a Sharp's rifle given to each of them, and if none of the rifles could be had, then he hoped he could give them a pistol each for their kindness. Governor Wise's son, Obadiah Jennings Wise, came to Brown's cell to see if the old abolitionist wanted to have clergy accompany him to the scaffold. Brown scoffed at the thought of having a Southern clergyman join him. Brown said that he would rather be joined by barefooted, bare-legged, ragged slave children and their old gray-headed slave mother. I should feel much prouder of such an escort, and I wish I could have it. At 7 a.m., carpenters began putting together the scaffold. Governor Wise called for 1,000 militiamen to secure the town, including cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, led there by one of their instructors, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Robert E. Lee, with over 200 soldiers, were also in the town. Soldiers encircled the town, with 2 lines of soldiers surrounding the scaffold. Virtually no civilians were allowed to be at the hanging. William B. Tolliver, a commander of one of the divisions of the Virginia militia, came to Brown to tell him that the time was approaching. Brown dashed off a letter and wrote a message to Mary, suggesting an inscription for his, Watson, and Oliver's gravestone in North Elba. James Campbell, the sheriff, and John Avis, the jailer, walked Brown out of his cell. Brown gave his silver watch to Avis and a Bible to Campbell. He was taken to the other prisoners. To Green and Copeland, the 2 African-American men captured with Brown, he stated, "Stand up like men, and do not betray your friends." Then he gave them 25 cents each, saying he had no more use for money. To Coppock and Cook, his conversations were a little heated. John Cook had said on the witness stand that Brown forced him into service. After a brief argument, they agreed that they both remembered differently. To Edwin Coppock, Brown said, "You have also made false statements, but I am glad to hear you have contradicted them." Brown's old friend Aaron Stevens said, "Goodbye, Captain. I know you are going to a better land." "I know I am," Brown said. "Bear up, as you have done, and never betray your friends." After that, Brown was let out of the jail. He was wearing a black hat, black coat and pants, white socks, and red slippers. Despite the popular imagery depicting Brown kissing a slave child in its mother's arms, the scene most likely didn't happen. He was completely surrounded by soldiers. However, as he left the jail, he handed a guard a note he scribbled that morning. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." The sheriff tied Brown's arms at the elbows with the rope, then brought him to a wagon pulled by 2 white horses. He was helped into the wagon and sat on a poplar box, which contained his black walnut coffin. Accompanying him on the wagon was Campbell, Avis, and George Sadler, the local undertaker. As they rode toward the gallows, Brown looked around him and stated, "This is a beautiful country. I have not cast my eyes over it before. This is while passing through the field." Avis, noticeably sad, agreed. Sadler told Brown, "You're the gamest man I ever saw, Captain Brown." Brown responded, "Yes, I was so trained up. It was one of the lessons of my mother, but it is hard to part from friends." At the execution site, Brown got off the wagon and climbed the stairs. Edmund Ruffin, an agronomist, pro-slavery advocate, and fire-eating secessionist, used his political connections to be not only present at the hanging, but close to the scaffold. Ruffin wrote, "His movements and manner gave no evidence of his being either terrified or concerned, and he went through what was required of him, apparently with as little agitation as if he had been the willing assistant instead of the victim." Avis and Campbell joined Brown on the scaffold. Brown turned to Avis and said, "Sir, I have no words to thank you for your kindness." Brown's hat was removed and a white linen hood placed over his head. Avis then positioned him over the trap door, tied his legs together, and adjusted the noose. Avis then asked Brown if he wanted to give the signal that he was ready by dropping a handkerchief. Brown answered, "No, I am ready at any time, but do not keep me needlessly waiting." However, he had to wait. The military escort who accompanied Brown to the scaffold had to find their correct position, so it took 10 minutes until the troops took their correct spot. When the troops were ready, the sheriff took an axe and cut the rope to the trap door. The door opened and Brown dropped only 2 feet, but that was enough to snap his spinal column. There was one spasm of the hands, Then the body jerked and quivered for about 5 minutes, but nothing extreme. John Preston of the Virginia Military Institute remembered his knees were scarcely bent, his arms were drawn up to a right angle at the elbow, with the hands clenched, but there was no writhing of the body, no violent heaving of the chest. At each feeble effort at respiration, the arms sank lower and his legs hung more relaxed, until at last, straight and lank, he dangled, swayed to and fro lightly by the wind. Preston then broke the silence by yelling, "So perish all such enemies of Virginia, all such enemies of the Union, all such foes of the human race." A young volunteer in the ranks, named John Wilkes Booth, agreed with the statement and later wrote, "I looked at the traitor and terrorizer with unlimited, undeniable contempt." The body was left to hang for 35 minutes. Then it was pulled up to the scaffold, where around 15 physicians examined the body to confirm death. Then Brown was laid in his coffin and escorted by cavalry to Harper's Ferry, where Mary awaited the body of her husband. On December 3rd, Mary headed to Philadelphia, then by boat to New York. There, undertakers from McGraw and Taylor dressed the body. Then Mary proceeded to North Elba, escorted by abolitionists J. Miller McKim and Wendell Phillips. They arrived in North Elba on the evening of Wednesday, December 7th. On December 8th, a simple funeral took place, and the coffin was placed on a table on the front porch so family and neighbors could come view the body. After that, the body was taken to a grave about 50 feet from the house and lowered into the ground, while the family of Lyman Epps sang Brown's favorite hymn, "Blow Ye the Trumpet Blow." John Brown was right. He said that his death would do more to end slavery than all of his actions up to that point. Southerners vilified him, calling him a traitor and a murderer. Many of the Northerners who stood up against Brown following the raid began to see him as more of a hero for the anti-slavery cause when he was executed. Anti-slavery societies banded together and upheld Brown as a symbol of freedom. Even though some of them denounced his use of violence, they stood by his belief that no one should be held in bondage. A prominent African-American abolitionist speaker said of Brown, "He was a lover of mankind, not of any particular class or color, but of all men. He knew no complexional distinctions between God's rational creatures. He fully, really, and actively believed in the equality and brotherhood of man. He is the only American citizen who has lived fully up to the Declaration of Independence. He admired Nat Turner as well as George Washington." Celebrations of John Brown didn't just appear in the United States. In Haiti, churches and even towns came together to remember the abolitionist who was inspired from that country's revolution. Leading citizens wore badges of mourning, and January 23rd was set aside as a day of prayer and remembrance. Victor Hugo, the French novelist and reformer, wrote a letter to the Haitian people stating, "Slavery in all its forms will disappear. What the South slew last December was not John Brown, but slavery. Henceforth, no matter what President Buchanan may say in his shameful message, the American Union must be considered dissolved. Between the North and the South stand the gallows of John Brown. Union is no longer possible. Such a crime cannot be spared." The South did more than condemn John Brown. They took their anger and paranoia about another possible raid and insurrection out on anyone who expressed anti-slavery sympathies. They saw John Brown everywhere. One newspaper commented, "We should literally have no room for anything else if we were to publish all the details of the whippings, tar and featherings, and hangings for the utterance of anti-slavery opinions in the South, which the mails daily bring us. The reign of terror in that section is marked by atrocities equal to those which desolated France 70 years ago. It is not safe for a Northern man to travel through the South at the present time for either business or pleasure." A Southern newspaper explained, "We regard every man in our midst an enemy to the institutions of the South who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing. If not, he should be requested to leave the country." Southern fire eaters who had long discussed secession now saw Brown's raid and his execution as the incentive to break the country apart, that the two halves could not get along. To them, secession was the only solution. In the run-up to the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party had to separate themselves from John Brown, who many Southerners and Northern Democrats attempted to place in the Republican Party. Lincoln would write, "You charge that we stir up insurrections among your slaves. We deny it. We deny it. And what is your proof? Harper's Ferry? John Brown? John Brown was no Republican, and you failed to implicate a single Republican in his Harper's Ferry enterprise. If any member of our party is guilty in that matter, you know it or you do not know it. If you do know it, you are inexcusable for not designating the man and proving the fact. If you do not know it, you are inexcusable for asserting it, and especially for persisting in the assertion after you have tried and failed to make the proof. You need not be told that persisting in a charge which one does not know to be true is simply malicious slander." What John Brown was able to do with his raid and his death was to worry Southerners, which stoked the fires of secession, leading to some of the Southern states leaving the Union and the country erupting in civil war. Did he cause the war? Of course not. But his actions did contribute to the uneasiness that many people in the South felt. He would be featured in a song entitled John Brown's Body, the tune of which was taken from a hymn, but Julia Ward Howe, a prominent abolitionist, would rewrite the song and name it the Battle Hymn of the Republic. John Brown's Body and the Battle Hymn of the Republic would be played by Union soldiers as they invaded parts of the South during the Civil War that ultimately ended slavery. Yes, he committed violence. His atrocities at Pottawatomie Creek and other locations are hideous stains on his and the country's history. But he was also a humanitarian who fought for equality. In his world, he was unique. He was a white man who advocated for the equality of all races, as well as men and women. He saw no distinction. All humans were his brothers and sisters. It was that core belief that drove him to fight so hard against slavery and dedicate his life to ending the institution. He was and is a controversial character in United States history, but he was also someone who helped propel the country forward, someone who had faults that he freely admitted, but strove ceaselessly to end the suffering of millions of people. His soul goes marching on.